The Hermit's Revenge by Nathanael. Visitors by Night. High in the branches of a ragged jack pine, a great horned owl turned its head in the darkness, alert to every sound and movement. The silhouette of an oddly shaped building stood in the moonlight, its eerie image reflected on the waters of a nearby river. Crowding the building's perimeter was a thick wall of trees that cast the moonlit clearing in a multitude of shades and shadows. The dull throb of a truck engine broke the stillness, and the old owl withdrew silently into the branches of the jack pine. Headlights emerged from the forest, bobbed eerily across the clearing, then stopped beside the deserted building. Two men left the cab of a beat-up half-ton truck. While one began working the large padlock on the building's only door, his partner walked to the rear of their vehicle, undid the tailgate, and climbed aboard. Within 20 minutes, the contents of several large barrels had been transferred into the rickety frame shack. The men then quickly relocked the door, climbed into their truck, and disappeared back into the forest. As the sounds of the vehicle slowly faded into the darkness, the owl edged out from under the branches of the jack pine, blinked its great bright eyes, and returned to the survey of its lonely realm. Chapter 1. The Storm. Isaac Calder struggled free of the blankets and swung his feet over the edge of the top bunk. He peered sleepily down at his cousin, Eric, who was slowly rousing himself. The luminous hands of a clock sitting on a nearby dresser registered 12 o'clock. Midnight. "Come on, guys," Eric's mother repeated from the doorway of their bedroom. "The storm's knocked out our power and I need your help." She placed the hissing kerosene lantern on a desk by the bunk bed and retreated to the hallway. "I'll meet you downstairs." Isaac groaned. Waking up in the middle of the night was tough after putting in a full day's work. He jumped from the top bunk, narrowly missing his cousin's foot. "Hey," Eric protested loudly, "watch it. We didn't bring you all the way to the wilds of northern Ontario just so I could be crippled by a rampaging galoot." Isaac grinned as he pulled a thick sweatshirt over his blonde hair and the t-shirt he'd worn to bed. "It's moments like this that make me grateful for leaving my cozy home in the suburbs to come up here and help you and your mom for the summer." Outside the small bedroom window, he could hear the summer storm lashing furiously against the pane. "It looks like the power to all the cabins has been knocked out." He peered out the window into the blackness. No lights anywhere. Catching a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, he ran a hand through his blonde hair. "Why do people need electricity at this time of night anyway?" Eric asked as he pulled on his jeans. "They should all be in bed asleep." Isaac smiled at his dark-haired cousin. Despite Eric's quiet, serious manner, there was something about him that always made Isaac smile. Hurriedly he finished dressing, picked the kerosene lantern off the desk, and led the way down the stairs of the lodge. His haggard-looking aunt was waiting for them by the front door, a carpenter's belt fastened over her raincoat. "We'd better get going. One of the bear hunters staying in cabin 6 came by a few minutes ago complaining that their roof was leaking. The storm blew a tree down and it tore off some shingles." She pushed open the front door and pointed to a bulky plastic bundle on the porch. "We'll drape this large tarp over the roof until morning. Shouldn't take us long." She waited while Isaac and Eric dragged heavy raincoats over their heads. Through the open door, flashes of lightning lit up the wild night sky. Isaac shuddered. "We'll be soaked to the skin in no time." He and Eric picked up the tarp, tucked their chins into their chests and followed Aunt Helga out into the storm, the beam of her flashlight pointing the way. The rain quickly drenched Isaac, running down his collar and into the various crevices of his clothing. By the time they reached the bear hunter's cabin, he was soaked. Aunt Helga drew them under the spreading branches of an evergreen, then turned the flashlight's beam onto the cabin before them. An old wooden ladder was propped against the side wall. "I came by a few minutes ago to check things out." She slowly moved the light upward to the roof. There's the culprit. In the glow of the flashlight, the remnants of a large poplar branch was scattered across the entire length of the roof. "Those things are always breaking off in the wind," Eric complained, "usually at the worst times." "Looks like the branch tore off quite a few shingles near the peak," Isaac said. Aunt Helga looked up into the black night sky and took a deep breath. "How many hunters are staying in this cabin anyway?" Isaac asked. "3, his aunt said. "As far as I can tell anyway. It's like having 3 phantoms staying with us, though. We hardly ever see them." She drew another breath. "I guess we'd better let our guests know what we're up to." She walked up to the front door, rapped loudly, and stepped back. Almost immediately the door opened a crack and a dark face appeared before them. "We're going to drape a tarp over your roof," Helga explained. "That should keep the rain out for now. We'll fix it properly tomorrow." Isaac expected the man to make some kind of response, but instead continued to stare out into the rain, his dark eyes burning into Helga Calder. Then ever so slowly the man's head pivoted toward the 2 boys, and for several long seconds his malevolent gaze fell directly on Isaac and Eric. Finally, without a word, he nodded sharply and disappeared back inside the cabin. Eric's mother rejoined them at the bottom of the steps. Man of few words, I guess. She pulled a small flashlight from her jacket pocket and handed it to her nephew. "Isaac, I'd like you to check the other cabins and see if everything's all right. Eric and I can handle this job. If anyone's up fretting about the storm, let them know that their electricity should be back on soon. If they're really upset, take them over to the lodge. They can wait by the fire until I get there." Turning to go, Isaac glanced up at the small window by the front door of the bear hunter's cabin. As he did, the same dark eyes quickly disappeared from sight. A shiver passed through him, a shiver he knew wasn't the result of the cold night rain seeping through his clothing. The path that wove among the cabins was cast in darkness, and even with the flashlight, Isaac had difficulty negotiating his way. 4 cottages were occupied, but only one showed signs of life, a faint light shining from the kitchen window. He paused by the front door, straining his ears for any sign of life from within. Finally, he mounted the steps and rapped lightly. He could barely hear the timid voice that answered his knock. "Yes, who is it?" "Mrs. Martin, it's Isaac Calder from the lodge. I've just come by to make sure everything is all right, and to let you know that the hydro will be back on shortly. Do you want a lantern or some more candles in the meantime?" There was another pause, and Isaac could hear the faint sound of voices from within. He thought it best to continue. "Mrs. Martin, you and your granddaughter are welcome to come over to the lodge and wait by the fire until the electricity comes back on." After another long moment, the door opened a crack. A tiny figure stood outlined in the dim light, a candle clutched tightly in one hand. With her other hand, the old woman gripped a blanket covering her frail shoulders. "I think we'll take you up on that," she said, a slight English accent marking her speech. She snuffed the candle, set it back inside the door, then stepped gingerly out into the rain. A young girl of about Isaac's age moved into the beam of the flashlight and helped Mrs. Martin down the steps. He'd met the girl before, Sarah Martin. She was slim and dark-eyed. Her long auburn hair fell halfway down her back. A plastic raincoat was draped over her head and shoulders. Isaac put a reassuring hand on Mrs. Martin's arm. "We're very sorry for the inconvenience," he apologized, as he led his 2 guests up to the lodge. "We'll get you dried out in no time." A kerosene lantern burned on the table by the fireplace in the main room of the lodge. In the hearth, a fire glowed warmly. Mrs. Martin removed the wet blanket from around her shoulders and edged closer to the warmth of the fireplace. "That feels rather good." Sarah slipped up beside her elderly grandmother and put a protective arm around her. Isaac was mildly surprised at how attractive Sarah was, even with the rain soaking her hair and streaking her face. "That was rather frightening," the older lady continued. "I don't remember hearing the air raid sirens, though. Did they come on tonight?" Isaac looked at the old woman. "Air raid sirens?" Sarah gave her head a quick, apologetic shake. "It's okay, Grandma. There are no air raid sirens anymore, remember? That only happened years ago during the war." A puzzled frown creased the old woman's face. Isaac stepped back from the fire. "I'd better see how my aunt and Eric are doing." He'd no sooner spoken than the front door banged open and Mrs. Calder and Eric stomped into the lodge. Isaac crossed the room to join them. "You're finished already?" "Oh, yeah," Eric said. "My mom's an old pro at emergency roof repairs." Aunt Helga looked worriedly at her guests as she hung up her raincoat. "I hope Isaac has made you comfortable." She kicked off her wet boots and stepped into a pair of worn slippers. "He's been the perfect gentleman," Mrs. Martin said. "I'm really sorry for the inconvenience," Isaac's aunt said. "We have a vacant room upstairs. How would you like to stay there for the night?" "That's very kind," Mrs. Martin said. "But I think we'll be all right once the power comes back on. It shouldn't be long, should it?" "I don't think so. The power company is usually very quick in times of emergencies. A tree probably fell on a line somewhere." Helga turned to Isaac and Eric, drawing them away from the fire and the Martins before she spoke. "You boys will have to get over to cabin 6 in the morning and fix that roof." "I'll bet those bear hunters will be long gone by the time we get there," Isaac said. "Yesterday morning I heard their motorboat leave at the crack of dawn." "I know. I watched them from my bedroom window." She lowered her voice slightly. "I noticed something peculiar about that, though, come to think of it. I had almost forgotten." Isaac and Eric edged closer. "What was that?" Eric asked. "They're supposed to be bear hunters, right?" The boys nodded. "Well, yesterday morning when they left on their great bear hunting expedition, they were completely unarmed. There wasn't a gun to be seen anywhere." Bear trap. The heavy downpour had long since soaked the old man to the skin, saturating his clothing and thick beard. It was past midnight, and the stretch of river he navigated in the darkness was silent and empty. Beaching his canoe, he motioned for the big dog to stay, then stepped onto the shore. Cautiously he made his way through the thick brush edging the shoreline and entered a small clearing. He moved across the rain-soaked ground to a thick stand of willows growing in a cluster across from him. High above him, almost obscured by the downpour, rose a platform. The old man shook his head in disgust. "Looks like them hunters came back," he said, wiping the rain from his face, "as if the poor black bear in this area don't have enough trouble trying to survive." It was then he noticed a large piece of meat hanging by a rope from one of the willows, dangling enticingly about 4 feet from the ground. He walked up to the bait and sniffed it. "Can't smell no poison, but that don't mean there ain't none." He sighed deeply. "Well, here we go again." With a heave on the rope, he brought the side of meat crashing to the ground. He then carefully carried it over to the river and tossed it into the current. "Come here, Shep," he called. The large dog leaped from the canoe and padded over to the old man. Carefully, the master led his dog under the sweeping branches of the willow trees, an area that was still mostly dry from the rainfall. He watched as the dog wandered under the trees for a moment, sniffing and marking its territory. The old man examined the dog tracks in the wet, sandy soil. "That should cause these city slickers something to think about," he said, retreating to the canoe with his dog. "Pretty pathetic way to catch a bear, no matter how ignorant the hunters. There just ain't enough black bear in these parts anymore, not that those city-slickin' morons would care." The old man and his dog settled themselves into the canoe, then slowly eased themselves down the darkened river toward home. Chapter 2. Breakfast Plans. When Isaac and Eric arrived down for breakfast the following morning, a number of guests from the resort were already seated around the long oak table. Eric's mom was bustling between the dining area and the kitchen, heaping the breakfast table with platters of toast, scrambled eggs, and pancakes. As the boys entered the kitchen, she motioned to Eric. "It's your turn to help out this morning." Eric groaned as he followed his mom into the kitchen. A large, red-faced man with a receding hairline waved Isaac over to the table. "Look what the wind blew in." His booming voice filled the dining area. "Morning, Mr. Gray." Isaac dropped into a chair beside the big man. "Sorry we're late for breakfast, but we had a late night." A mild surge of anxiety swept through him as he noticed Sarah Martin seated at the far end of the table. Quickly he averted his gaze, turning to the guest seated opposite him. "That was quite a thunderstorm we had last night." The woman on the other side of the table nodded pleasantly. She was on the stout side and rather dishevelled looking. "It's been a while since I've heard thunder that loud." She extended her hand. "I'm Donna Partridge. I'm a conservation officer." Isaac shook the young woman's hand. "That's a good name for a game warden." Donna Partridge smiled warmly. "This is a lovely resort, even if I am here on business." "What business are you on right now, Miss Partridge?" asked Sarah's grandmother. "You might have read in the newspapers a few months ago that the government put a temporary ban on all mining or lumbering activity in this area. I'm here to make sure that this law is enforced." The assurance in Donna Partridge's voice turned everyone's attention her way. "Apparently the government is considering making this region into a provincial park. The final decision is supposed to be made next week." "A provincial park? How exciting!" Mrs. Martin's wrinkled face lit up. "What would that mean?" Isaac asked. "Well, I'm sure it would be a real bonus for tourist operators like yourselves. On the other hand, a lot of pressure is being put on the government to keep the area open for development. Some mining companies insist that this is still a viable area for finding gold and developing a mine." "I think a park's a wonderful idea," Aunt Helga said. "Speaking of business," Mr. Gray interrupted, turning to their hostess, "that was a most generous offer I made to you yesterday. Have you given it any more thought?" Aunt Helga refilled the milk pitcher before answering. "I'll be discussing it with my husband when I visit him at the hospital later today." "Your husband is in the hospital?" Mrs. Martin asked. Aunt Helga nodded. "He fractured his leg in a fall earlier this summer. Unfortunately, complications set in and surgery was required. We hope he'll be able to come home in a few days." "Must be tough not having your husband around, especially on a place with so much to do," Donna Partridge said. "Well, getting back to my offer," Mr. Gray interrupted again. "This resort does need a lot of work, and it'll never fetch more than what I've offered, especially considering the additional investment I plan on making to bring this place up to snuff." He turned to his breakfast partners. "My dream is to turn this little establishment into a 5-star resort and casino. Lake Kenogami is the perfect location. All that's lacking is a generous infusion of capital." Isaac's mouth dropped in surprise. He glanced quickly at his cousin who was standing by the kitchen door, a look of shock on his face. Surely Aunt Helga wasn't thinking about selling the resort. If they sold the resort, where would the family move to? There was no way Eric would want to leave Kenogami and move back to the city. He'd hated living there. "What if they do make this area into a provincial park?" Eric stammered. "Will they still allow you to build a casino?" "All the better if they do make it into a park," Jack Gray said, slapping his hand on the table. "The province doesn't have enough parks as it is, so the tourists will flock here like honey bees to a daffodil." He paused and stared thoughtfully for a moment at Helga Calder. "You know, I think I just might drop in at the hospital today myself and talk some sense into that husband of yours." Isaac's aunt flushed angrily. She turned on her heels and disappeared into the kitchen. "So, Miss Partridge, What exactly is entailed in being a conservation officer? Sarah Martin's sudden question caught Isaac by surprise. He looked up at her as she continued. It sounds like an exciting job. Donna Partridge smiled broadly. Oh, call me Donna. She paused, as if searching for the right words. Well, actually, my first business is to investigate a report of a wolf sighting. Mr. Gray gave a grunt and looked up at the speaker. A wolf sighting, he echoed, his voice rising. I had no idea there were still timber wolves in this part of the north. Eric appeared at the table with a fresh platter of toast. It must have been those bear hunters in cabin 6 that made the report. A couple of days ago they complained that one of the bear baits they'd left out had been destroyed and they'd seen wolf tracks there. I doubt if those hunters would know a wolf from a porcupine. Mr. Gray laughed nervously. I don't think we need to worry, do we? Timber wolves are supposed to be afraid of people. They usually keep their distance, Donna Partridge agreed. On the other hand, they might prove to be a great attraction for casino goers. She smiled teasingly at Jack Gray. Anyway, the bear hunters have given me directions on how to get to the spot, so I should be able to determine whether or not it was wolves. I plan on heading over there this morning to take a look. Aunt Helga reappeared. Would anyone like more bacon and eggs? Her words were almost drowned out by a sudden commotion at the front door. Everyone turned as the door banged open, and a boy about Isaac's age carrying a canvas pack-sack entered. He paused to drop his bundle, then flashed a broad grin at Aunt Helga. Don't tell me I've missed breakfast again. You know you're never too late to eat here, Wes, Aunt Helga said with a laugh. We've barely started. She steered him over to a spot at the head of the table. Has everyone met Wes? She asked. Sarah's grandmother looked up at the dark-haired, dark-skinned boy and smiled politely. I don't believe I've had the pleasure. Well, this is Wes Hamilton, Aunt Helga continued. Wes lives across the lake. He's a good friend of Eric and Isaac and has been a big help since my husband's accident. We seem to be putting him to work a lot lately. Wes nodded to those at the table. Miss Partridge and I met Wes yesterday, Jack Gray said with an enormous smile. First time I met an honest-to-goodness Ojibwe, he added. Didn't know there were any native people in these parts. Isaac squirmed as Jack Gray continued. In fact, Donna and I transacted a small business arrangement with Wes. He paused, relishing the attention. We've hired Wes to take us down the Blanche River this morning on his barge. His barge? Eric echoed, dropping into a chair beside Wes. Wes laughed, slapping Eric on the back. A sightseeing tour, my curious Shagnash friend. Sounds like fun, Eric said weakly. Where did you get a barge? Isaac asked. Wes stacked his plate with a mound of blueberry pancakes. Remember Jessie, Isaac? He asked. You must have met her last week at my grandfather's funeral. She lives on an island down at the north end of the lake. An image of a stocky, colourfully dressed older woman flashed through Isaac's mind. Jessie let you use her barge? He asked in surprise. Oh, sure. She thinks I'm the cat's meow, and what's even better, there's room enough for a small village on that contraption. We thought we'd make it a bit of an outing, Jack Gray cut in. What a hoot, Eric said. Can anyone go? I've only signed up Mr. Gray and Donna so far, Wes said. If everyone comes, we can have a big picnic, Jack Gray suggested. Sarah's grandmother clapped her hands together, her eyes shining brightly. What a lovely idea. So, you're going down the Blanche? Aunt Helga asked, frowning slightly. Wes was taking Mr. Gray on a tour of the river, Donna Partridge answered. So I asked him if he could stop for a few minutes at the spot where the complaint was made about the wolves. It's on the way. A picnic, old Mrs. Martin said. I'm sure Sarah would love to go. It's such a beautiful day. Well, then it's settled, Mr. Gray boomed. We'll make a morning out of it. Now, you boys, He pointed to Eric and Isaac. "You'll have to come too. We can't have you working while everyone else is out having fun." He looked over at Aunt Helga. "And you, Mrs. Calder. It's high time you took a break and spent a couple of hours relaxing and enjoying yourself. What do you say?" "Oh, I couldn't. Not today, anyway. How long will you be? I need the shingles on cabin 6 replaced before dark." "We should be back just after lunch," Wes said. "They'd still have lots of time to finish the roof." Helga shrugged. "As long as the job gets done," she said reluctantly. "I'm afraid it may rain again tonight. And," she added, looking at her son, "these breakfast dishes need doing before anyone goes out on the river." Isaac pushed back from the table, grinning. "Might as well bring our fishing rods." He glanced over at Sarah and caught her eye for a fleeting second. Had he noticed the beginnings of a smile, or was it just his imagination? "Well, fellas," Wes said, "you'd better get in there and wash those dishes." He looked up from his pancakes and winked. "Then it's down the Blanche River for a little fishing on Jesse's once-in-a-lifetime barge." Chapter 3. Jesse's Barge. The Blanche River's narrow green waters wove calmly through the forest of tall evergreen and poplar trees. Jesse's cumbersome barge seemed strangely out of place as it lumbered through the peaceful wilderness. The craft was a picture of simplicity. A flat surface the width of 3 parked cars rested securely on 2 large green aeroplane pontoons. Several metal lawn chairs were scattered under a canvas tarpaulin which was perched on 4 rusty poles. Squatting on the stern was a beat-up 20-horsepower motor, coughing and sputtering the barge down the winding river. In addition to Isaac, Eric and Wes, 5 of the resort's guests had made the trip. Jack Gray, Donna Partridge, Sarah Martin and her aunt, and a newspaper reporter named Gallagher. Gallagher was a thin, curly-haired man with the unhealthy look of someone who spent too much time indoors hunched over his computer. Isaac guessed that the reporter was about 35 years old, and except for the curly hair, looked a lot like a skinny Clark Kent, dark-rimmed glasses and all. Periodically, he would lift his camera and snap a shot of the slowly passing landscape. Wes stood at the wheel in the middle of the barge, a blue and white sailor's cap perched jauntily on his head. A few feet to his right, Isaac and Eric leaned over the barge's one rail, their fishing lines trailing behind the slow-moving craft. "Not bad, eh?" Wes said. Eric grinned. "Truly one of the world's great wonders, Wes. As old and mysterious as the pyramids of ancient Egypt." "And that sailor's hat," Isaac added, watching Wes out of the corner of his eye. "What rank does a sailor's hat like that make you, Admiral?" "You're in no position to make light of my favourite lady's most prized possession, my fine, fickle friends. When you were given the opportunity to get out of a little work, you were all happy to go on a free fishing trip. Just because the old girl hasn't been out of the boathouse in a couple of years doesn't mean she should be made light of by the likes of you 2 landlubbers." "Hard to tell whether you're talking about the barge or Jesse," Eric said. His and Isaac's laughter drowned out Wes's indignant protests. Gallagher got up from his lawn chair and joined Isaac and Eric by the railing. "What beautiful scenery." He drew in a lungful of the warm July air. "It makes me feel like we're the only people for miles and miles." Wes laughed. "Well, that's not far from the truth, Mr. Gallagher. It doesn't get much more remote than this." "That's the beauty of it," Jack Gray chimed in enthusiastically. He struggled from his chair and made his way over to where Sarah sat with her grandmother. "People who have lived all their lives in the city can only dream of places like this. Why, they'd be falling all over themselves to spend their hard-earned cash up here, relaxing and soaking in the atmosphere." He turned and winked at Sarah, then walked slowly over to the railing where Isaac and Eric stood fishing. "That's why I'm so interested in setting up a casino in this area. It's perfect, right smack dab in the middle of the North Country. With an infusion of investment capital and a concerted advertising campaign, I'll turn this spot into the Shangri-La of the North." "I don't think my parents are interested in selling," Eric said shortly. "Oh, they will be. We all have our price." Everyone was quiet for a moment. The sound of the outboard motor suddenly seemed out of place on such a peaceful river. Wes swung the barge close to the east bank, maneuvering it around another twist in the current, before starting slowly down a straight stretch. Sarah Martin turned in her chair and looked back at Isaac. "Where does this river lead?" she asked. "I mean, if we followed it long enough." "To a little town called Swastika." "Swastika," Sarah's grandmother echoed loudly. "What kind of name is that for a town? Our boys went to war to get rid of things like swastikas." Eric, who had been preoccupied with his fishing line, turned to the elderly lady. "Actually, it's not what you might think, Mrs. Martin. Swastika is the name of an ancient good luck symbol, and the town got its name long before anyone ever heard of Hitler. The Canadian government tried to change the town's name to Winston during the war, but the local people objected, and eventually the government backed down." Wes slowed the barge, navigating it around a tree that had toppled into the river. "How much farther to the bear trap?" Donna Partridge asked. "Another 10 minutes or so," Wes said. "At the speed we're travelling," Eric said. "That's only about 200 yards. Wes grunted as a ripple of laughter passed among the passengers. On the south bank of the river, the tall shape of a mine's head frame appeared among the trees fringing the shoreline. "What on earth is that?" Jack Gray asked. "A grain elevator." "The old Baldwin Mine," Eric replied. "Or at least what's left of it. It's been out of production for years." "What did they mine here?" Gallagher asked. "Gold," Eric said. "The Baldwin was never much of a mine, though. Now all that's left is that head frame." "That building has such an odd shape," Mrs. Martin observed. "The head frame stands over the mine shaft and houses the cage or elevator, which moves men and material down into the mine," Wes said, guiding the barge to within a few feet of the shore. "That's why the building is so tall. The cage takes the miners underground." Most of the passengers had now risen from their lawn chairs for a better look. The mine building was set back from the river in a small clearing. A large pile of crushed rock was the only other feature visible from the barge. "Look at that," Donna Partridge said, pointing to an object floating along the shoreline. The others leaned over the railing for a better view. "A dead fish," Isaac said. Wes shifted the outboard motor into neutral so that they drifted ashore along a narrow stretch of beach in front of the mine. "It is a dead fish," old Mrs. Martin said, drawing a lace-trimmed handkerchief from her pocket and covering her mouth and nose. "There must be a half-dozen of them," Isaac said, shaking his head. "What could have killed them?" Donna Partridge rummaged around in her pack-sack for a pair of rubber gloves. She leaned over the edge of the barge and scooped one of the small dead perch from the shallow water. "I'll send this one back to the lab for analysis," she said, dropping it into a plastic bag. "Perch are quite sensitive," she explained. "Sometimes even a change in water temperature is enough to kill them." "Or they could have been poisoned," Wes said ominously. Isaac looked over at his friend. "Poisoned? How could they have been poisoned way out in the middle of nowhere?" "We'd better get going," Wes said. He shifted the motor into gear, then maneuvered the barge away from the shoreline and out into the current. Gallagher joined Wes by the wheel as the large craft resumed its ponderous course. "I wouldn't mind taking a closer look at the Baldwin Mine sometime," he said. "I've never been that close to an abandoned gold mine before. It might make for a good story." Wes shrugged. "Why not? I can bring you back in a day or two, give you time to research the history of the old mine." Gallagher smiled and nodded. "That would be dandy. They had only travelled for another 5 minutes when Wes suddenly cut the motor and guided the barge into the far shoreline. The riverbank was cluttered with brush and fallen timber, and it was not until they had bumped into a clutch of tag alders that Isaac noticed a canoe hidden among the brush by the riverbank. "Whose canoe is that?" Wes's face remained impassive as he allowed the barge to drift downstream for several more feet before beaching it beside the mouth of a narrow stream. "Beaver Creek." Wes stepped from the barge and anchored it to a large piece of driftwood. "Come ashore," he said with the wave of his arm. Donna Partridge stepped gingerly from the barge and reached back to help Mrs. Martin down onto the beach. Then, one by one, the passengers climbed ashore, each eyeing Wes curiously. With a mischievous grin on his face, Wes turned and parted 2 large bushes, exposing a narrow pathway. "If you will kindly step this way, ladies and gentlemen," Wes said, pretending to speak into a microphone, "you will soon have the opportunity of meeting one of the North's truly remarkable characters." The others fell in behind their guide, carefully negotiating the narrow trail while keeping one eye on the stream which ran a parallel course a few feet away. Large poplar and willow trees provided a canopy high above their heads. In less than 5 minutes, Wes drew them to a halt at the top of a slight rise. "A beaver dam," Donna Partridge exclaimed, peering through the thin veil of trees. Before them, a large beaver dam stretched into the distance before them. Beyond it lay a shimmering dark pond. Its surface was strewn with numerous dead trees and stumps. The late morning sun cast a great variety of reflections on its still surface. A wall of grey mud seemed to line the pond near where Isaac stood, and emanating from it was a muddy, sour odour. Suddenly, an old man dressed in baggy khaki pants and a soiled white T-shirt stepped from behind a cedar tree directly in front of them. Everyone instinctively took a step back as the strange-looking character glared angrily in their direction. A long, ragged beard stretched halfway down his thin chest, and a shock of white hair seemed to erupt straight up from his head. Wes broke into a broad smile. "Shubel," he called, then waved his small group forward. "Come on, everyone, and meet a real, honest-to-goodness hermit." The old woodsman remained beside the cedar tree, his angry expression unchanged as Wes led his little party toward him. "Folks," Wes said, "it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Shubel Chase, one of the orneriest, most backward men ever to grace the far north. In fact, he's so ornery he lives out here in the middle of nowhere by himself. No one else can stand him. Appears you brung the whole reserve down with you, Wes. I reckon you must have seen my canoe back at the river and curiosity got the best of you." The man nodded at the 8 people gathered around him, his eyes falling on Eric. "I know this young fella," he said. "You're Jim Calder's boy." Eric grinned. "I'm surprised you remember me, Mr. Chase. You haven't been by our place for a while." "What are you doing here, Mr. Chase?" Mrs. Martin asked. "This certainly isn't a place where one would expect to find another human being." "Well, I was just checking out this beaver family, but I reckon I might as well be in downtown New York City, what with all the tourists this spot seems to be attracting." "How many beaver would live in a pond like this?" Gallagher asked, snapping a picture. The old man turned and looked out over the pond behind them. "See that house over yonder?" He pointed across the pond to a large mound of twigs and branches protruding from the water. "A family of 4 beaver live there, 2 adults and 2 young'uns. They're sleeping right now, though. They do most of their work at night." "Are you going to trap them?" Gallagher asked. "Nope, gave that up years ago. Not enough beaver left anymore for me to be going around killing them." "What are you doing here, then?" Eric asked. "Just keeping my eye on things. I guess you might say I'm concerned for this little family's welfare. Wild animals need all the friends they can get nowadays." Mrs. Martin took a cloth handkerchief from her pocket spread it on a fallen log beside the trail, and sat down. Isaac and the others promptly followed her example, taking an opportunity to quietly take in the scene before them. "You go by the old Baldwin lately, Wes?" Shubel finally asked. Wes nodded. "Notice anything strange?" "Dead fish, Shubel. There must have been a dozen dead fish floating in the water." "Something strange is going on at that old mine. Lots of tracks, vehicles, and people coming and going. Looks like someone might be storing stuff there." "Why would someone be storing things there?" Eric asked. "They're not thinking of reopening the mine, are they?" "Not likely. They never found much gold at the Baldwin. Despite what a lot of folks might say, though, this is still a great gold mining area." "Maybe the company is storing equipment at the site while they do some exploration work in the area," Isaac suggested. "They shouldn't be," Donna Partridge said. "This whole area has been off-limits to mineral exploration for months, and if the government decides to turn the area into a provincial park, it'll be off-limits to mineral exploration forever." Jack Gray moved his big bulk with a shrug. "Well, I don't suppose they're doing any real harm way out here. Unless whoever is storing stuff in the old mine is responsible for killing those fish," Wes said. Isaac raised one eyebrow and exchanged a glance with Eric. "I hate to rush everyone," Donna Partridge said, getting to her feet. "But I've got a lot of work to do today. That bear trap still has to be checked." She paused, looking at the old man. "Which reminds me, Mr. Chase, have you seen any signs of wolves in this area?" The faint shadow of a grin flitted across Shubel Chase's face. "Not that I can recall, leastwise not recently. There was a family of timber wolves just west of here. Maybe they've come back." "I sure hope not," Jack Gray said, his eyes widening. "Well," Wes said, rising to his feet, "let's get a move on. We've got to finish our little excursion and make sure that these boys get home in time to finish shingling that roof." As they trudged back down the trail to Jesse's barge, Isaac's thoughts went to his aunt alone back at the lodge, and a feeling of guilt crept over him. Chapter 4. Up on the Roof. Isaac sat on the small stool staring at the telephone receiver in his hand for almost a full minute before he finally set it back down on the cradle. Aunt Helga moved up beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Isaac looked up at her blankly before nodding his head. He rose slowly to his feet. "I spoke to your mother earlier this morning," Aunt Helga said. "She explained everything to me then." "I thought they might be able to work it out," Isaac said, a note of bitterness creeping into his voice. "That's one of the reasons I agreed to come up here for the summer, to give them some time alone so they could patch things up. I didn't expect my dad to move out of the house already. He hardly gave it a try." "I know." She gave her nephew's arm a squeeze. "Don't give up on them yet, and keep praying for them. The Lord promises to answer prayers." Isaac picked up his aunt's Bible that was sitting on the small table by the phone. "Wes' grandfather said we should read through the Gospel of John this summer. I'm almost halfway through. It's an amazing book for learning more about Jesus." Aunt Helga smiled. "There's no better way to spend your time than learning more about the Lord. You know the Bible tells us to cast all your cares on Him, because He cares for you. And that means telling Jesus exactly how you feel about your parents splitting up." Isaac nodded. "I'll try. In the meantime, I'd better get out there or Eric will have that roof all fixed up by himself." He set the Bible back down and gave his aunt a quick hug. Outside, the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he made his way down the trail to Cabin 6. Quickly, he scaled the ladder and scampered up the slope to where his cousin sat straddling the peak. "Everything okay?" Eric asked. Mom seemed kind of bent out of shape about that phone call. Isaac nodded. "My folks have split up." Eric groaned softly. "I was afraid of that. He finished tacking the shingle into place, then eyed his cousin uneasily. "I pretty well finished things off while you were gone. The only spot I'm not sure about is up here on the peak. The rest of the roof ought to be okay, but I had to do this section pretty much piecemeal. Hope there aren't any spots for the rain to get in." "It looks fine," Isaac said, surveying the finished work. Eric mopped his brow with the bottom of his t-shirt. "There is one way to find out." "How's that?" "Put it to the test." Isaac wrinkled his brow. "How do we do that? Wait for the next storm?" "Come on." Eric led the way down off the roof and over to a long length of garden hose laying on the ground by an outside tap. Quickly he unrolled the hose, attached one end to the tap, then dragged the other end up the ladder. "Turn on the water when I give the word." He scrambled up the roof to the peak, then pointed the nozzle down at the shingles. "Turn it on." For several minutes Eric stood on the peak, thoroughly drenching the new shingles. Finally, he gave Isaac a wave. "Okay, that ought to do it. Turn it off." Eric tossed the hose to his cousin, then began edging his way down the wet shingles. Halfway to the bottom of the steep slope, his feet suddenly shot out from under him. With a sharp cry, Eric slid the rest of the way, slammed into the ladder, and then came crashing to the ground at Isaac's feet. "Eric, are you okay?" Isaac dropped to his knees by his cousin. Eric was on his back. His eyes were closed and he was muttering to himself, but the ground under him looked soft and was covered with pine needles. "Are you okay?" Isaac repeated. Eric rolled slowly over, pushed himself to his knees, then struggled to his feet. He stood for a moment, gathering his breath. Then he bent over and rolled up his pant leg. His calf had been scraped by the ladder from knee to ankle. "Ouch," Isaac said. "That looks sore." "At least it isn't bleeding much, mostly just a scrape." He hobbled a few steps, then leaned on Isaac's shoulder, gritting his teeth. "Looks like you guys are having fun." Both boys jumped at the unexpected voice. They turned to find Wes standing in the shadows of a spreading willow tree. "What are you up to now? Do I always have to be watching over you like a mother hen to keep you out of trouble?" Eric made a face at his friend, then looked back down at his knee. "My nimble-footed cousin here fell off the roof, Wes," Isaac said with a grin. "We were fixing some shingles that were knocked off in last night's storm." Wes ambled over to Eric and looked at his rolled-up pant leg. "Looks like you came out second best, all right. Usually happens when you take a notion to tumble off an 8-foot roof." "You'd better go get that cleaned and put a bandage on the worst of it," Isaac suggested. Eric glanced down at the scrape, then with a shrug started up the path to the lodge. "Wait until I get back before you check out that leak," he said over his shoulder. "I'll just be a minute." "Nasty," Wes said, watching Eric's retreating figure. "Lucky he didn't break his neck." "Eric's tough." The two boys were quiet for a moment as they watched their friend disappear up the trail to the lodge. Wes finally cleared his throat. "Your aunt told me about your parents splitting up. Tough break, but hopefully they'll patch things up." Isaac nodded. "Maybe." Wes turned and looked out over the lake. "Do you like it here?" Isaac was taken back by the unexpected question. "Yeah. It's great." Wes grinned at him. "I wish my old granddad was still around. He always knew the right thing to say when someone was having problems. But you knew that." Isaac nodded. "Your grandfather was pretty amazing. After all, he was the one who opened my eyes to the fact that I was lost and needed Christ to save me. But I just wish I'd gotten to know the old man better." "Well, I guess you will one day." Isaac looked at the other boy in surprise, then his face lightened. "Oh, I see what you mean. I'll get to know him better one day in heaven." Wes nodded. Now he was someone who could really roll with the punches. Being a Christian wasn't just some philosophy or dried-up old religion to him. He always put his faith in God to watch over him and turn everything out for the best. Isaac looked back up the trail to see if his cousin was returning. Too bad Eric hasn't made that decision yet. Wes nodded. We've all got to make that decision for ourselves, and we can only do it when we're ready. Let's just pray he doesn't leave it too late. They stood silently together for the next few minutes, deep in thought, until finally Eric reappeared, limping slowly down the trail toward them. Isaac's cousin was now wearing a clean t-shirt and jeans, and his hair was freshly combed. Isaac's hand went instinctively up to his messed-up hair. I cleaned out the grit and swabbed it with ointment, Eric said, walking past them to the door of the bear hunter's cabin. Come on, we'd better check to see if any water got inside. He fished in his pocket. I brought the master key. He unlocked the door, then looked over at Wes. We doused the roof with water after replacing the shingles. Now we'll find out if all our hard work paid off. The room into which they stepped was large and gloomy. The thick log walls seemed to soak up most of the sunlight allowed by the cottage's 2 small windows. A few pieces of furniture were scattered about the living room. A large cooking stove, table and chairs, and a long sofa which stretched the length of one wall. A card table was set up in front of the cook stove, and several sheets of paper were scattered across its surface. Looks like everything's dry enough, Eric said. Yep, Isaac agreed. I guess our operation was a success. Eric limped over to the card table. Good thing it didn't leak on any of these papers. They look important. He picked up one as Isaac and Wes joined him. Look at this. He thrust a paper at his cousin and picked up a couple more. They're land deeds to property on Lake Kenogami. And take a look at this. Isaac picked up a topographic map from the table. It's a map of the Kenogami area. What would bear hunters be doing with property deeds? Eric asked, moving around the table and peering over his cousin's shoulder. Isaac pointed to a red mark beside the Waboose River on the north end of the lake. What could that large X mean? Must be where they put one of their bear baits, Wes suggested. In the distance, the faint sound of an outboard motor drifted in through the open front door. Let's get out of here, Isaac said. That could be them. Quickly they dropped the documents back on the table, then tumbled out the doorway into the sunshine. It's only Donna Partridge, Isaac said, peering through the trees to the lake. A motorboat was approaching the dock in front of the lodge. What could those bear hunters be doing with all those property deeds? Eric asked as he relocked the cabin door. Isaac was silent for a minute. Did you notice something else? The men in that cabin are supposed to be hunters, but there wasn't a thing in there that reminded me it was being used by a bunch of hunters. But if they're not hunters, Wes said, who are they and what are they doing here? Chapter 5. The Parable. A light evening breeze drifted in from the west end of Lake Kenogami, stirring the tall stand of birch trees in front of the lodge. On a stretch of beach by the dock, a bonfire blazed, casting shadows on the figures gathered in its glow. What time did you tell everyone to be here? Isaac asked his cousin. Eric dropped an armful of long, pointed sticks onto the sand, then stepped back to admire the blaze. Any time now, he said, squinting at the luminous hands of his watch. It's past 9:30, although Wes did say he'd be late. Isaac eyed the packages of hot dogs and buns stacked on the table beside them. Did you bring your guitar? Eric was about to answer when they were interrupted by a shout from the trees behind them. Hi, guys. Donna Partridge appeared from the darkness. Close behind was Gallagher, the newspaper man. This is neat, Donna exclaimed. Reminds me of summer camp when I was a kid. Gallagher grinned widely as he took in the scene before him. Who else is coming? Donna asked. Sarah Martin and her grandma, Isaac said. Jack Gray and my aunt, of course. I don't think any of the others are interested. Not even our bear hunter friends? Gallagher said with a laugh. Haven't seen them all day." A slight noise from the shoreline drew their attention. What a beautiful bonfire. Aunt Helga was leading Jack Gray, Sarah and Martha Martin down onto the beach. "Good evening, everyone," Jack said in his loud voice. "What a wonderfully nostalgic sight this is." He stretched his hands out to the fire with a satisfied air. "Glad you could make it, Mr. Gray," Isaac said. "You too, Mrs. Martin. Sarah." Sarah smiled shyly, stepping slightly into the shadows. "Well, come on, everyone," Aunt Helga said, waving them all over to the benches around the fire. "Have a seat. Eric, let's break out that guitar, and we'll make them earn their dinner tonight." The guests seated themselves while Eric nervously strapped on his guitar. "I'll try to stick to songs that everyone knows." "Yeah," Jack Gray said with a laugh. "None of your rock and roll stuff." "Why don't we start with a few old folk songs?" Aunt Helga suggested. "Like Michael Row the Boat Ashore. Everybody probably knows that." "Good choice," Mrs. Martin said. "That's one I know." A moment later they had a real sing-song going, and even Jack Gray's singing voice didn't sound too bad. Isaac had always been embarrassed by his own singing, especially since his voice had changed octaves a couple of years ago. So he kept his volume to a minimum and listened for Sarah. The songs went from Michael and his boat to I'll Fly Away to This Land Is Your Land. Finally, after about 24 tunes and a third rendition of She'll Be Comin' Around the Mountain, the singers had had enough and voted to start roasting some wieners. "Oh, this is so much fun," Mrs. Martin said with a giggle. "Reminds me of going to the shore back home when I was a girl." "I wonder what happened to Wes?" Isaac asked, as the wieners were doled out and fastened to the end of the sharp sticks that Eric had prepared. "Well, knowing Wes," Aunt Helga said, "he'll probably show up just as we're heading off to bed." "Wieners always taste better roasted over a fire on the beach," Isaac said. "Burned or not." "We've got marshmallows for dessert," Aunt Helga reminded everyone. Isaac crouched beside Donna Partridge and held his stick out over the fire. "Did you find any sign of wolves back at the bear hunters' camp?" She looked at him, then back at the fire. "There were some tracks, all right," she said, "but I couldn't tell if they were made by a wolf or a dog. That rain we had obliterated most everything else. I was able to make out some people tracks, though." "You think it might have been people who destroyed the bear bait?" Donna paused, scanning the faces gathered around the bonfire. "Perhaps," she finally said. "Maybe the same ones that are killing fish at the Baldwin." Mrs. Martin sucked in her breath noisily, then gave a few soft tisk-tisks. Sarah moved up beside her grandmother and placed a blanket around her shoulders. The pale light from the moon and the glow from the bonfire lit up Sarah's dark hair and fair complexion. "What a bunch of gloomy gusses," Jack Gray scoffed. "Come on. This isn't the city where there are killers and con men at every corner. This is the Garden of Eden, for crying out loud." "Remember," Helga reminded him, "there was a serpent in the Garden of Eden too." Just then the low sound of an outboard motor muttered from the darkness. A faint light could be seen rapidly approaching the shoreline. "You were right, Mom," Eric said. "Everyone's ready to go home and Wes shows up." In the glow from the bonfire they could see Wes draw his boat up onto the beach and stroll nonchalantly toward them. "Howdy, folks," he said with his ever-present grin. "Started the party without me, I see." "Come and join us, Wes," Helga said. "Better late than never." Eric handed his friend a stick and a wiener. "I'm starved," Wes said. "I went out with Jessie to check on some problems she's been having with her trapping ground, so I missed supper." He held the wiener out over the dying flames. Donna Partridge immediately perked up. "Anything serious?" "I don't think so. She had a few traps sprung last week. Someone or something seems to be taking offense at Jessie's predatory ways." Jack Gray edged up to the fire. "Do you know any good Ojibwe legends?" Wes gave the older man a sly glance. "One or two." "Well, this would be the perfect place for one of those tales, a real scary one." Gallagher perked up. "Yes, that would be splendid. Might make for a good newspaper article." Wes stared down into the fire for a moment or two. Finally, he looked up at the circle of people surrounding him. "I remember a tale that my grandfather told me, which Mrs. Martin might appreciate. It was one that I'll never forget." Isaac found himself crowding a little closer to the campfire. Many years ago, during the time of the Great Wars with the Iroquois, there was an Ojibwe village on the shores of the grassy river west of here. It was a small village, and the people lived in constant fear of an attack by the dreaded Iroquois warriors. One warm spring morning, many of the men left the village for the day to hunt moose. While they were gone, a roving band of Iroquois attacked the village. During the raid, one of the Iroquois entered the tepee of an old woman who was caring for her tiny grandson, the chief's only child. The warrior pushed the woman aside, then went to where she had hidden the baby, for he heard its cry. He pulled the infant from its hiding place and was about to dash the child against the floor when another warrior entered the tepee. The second man seized the child from his comrade, handed it back to the old woman, then thrust the other man from the birch bark dwelling. It was at that moment that the men of the village returned, routing the surprised Iroquois. When the battle was over, the old woman went among the dead and injured looking for the Iroquois warrior who had saved her grandson. Finally she found him, badly injured and just barely alive. The woman carefully moved the man to her tepee and began to nurse him back to health. This, however, caused much anger among the people of the village. "This man saved the life of the chief's son," she exclaimed angrily, but the people were determined that this one remaining warrior should meet the same fate as his comrades. The old woman stubbornly held her ground, refusing to let anyone into the tepee where the wounded Iroquois lay. In the days to follow, while the warrior continued to recover from his wounds, hard times fell upon the village by the grassy river. No moose were killed that spring, and the fishing was very poor. Even the small animals like the rabbit and the partridge seemed to have fled the area. Once again, the people began to murmur about the Iroquois warrior. Perhaps his presence was the reason that misfortune had struck their community. One evening, the men met around the campfire, furious at their chief's mother-in-law, and determined to remove the cloud which now hung over their village. "Surely our children go hungry because of this Iroquois dog who has brought trouble to our people," they said. But the old woman would not relent. The next evening, one of the elders of the village presented a plan to the others. He reminded them that every morning at sunrise the old woman left her tepee to go down to the river for water. "We will go into the woman's tepee when she leaves for the river, and we will kill the Iroquois," he told the others. The next morning, when the old woman left for the river, several of the men entered her tepee. To their dismay, they discovered that their enemy was armed with a rifle and waiting for them. The men quickly backed out of the tepee and decided instead to burn the Iroquois out of his shelter. Swiftly they piled branches and dried grass around the birch bark dwelling and set it on fire. The flames leaped up the walls of the tepee and soon engulfed the flimsy structure, smoke billowing high into the air. But the old woman had seen the smoke from the river and rushed back to her tepee. When she returned, the men grabbed her to prevent her from entering the flames, but she fought like a wildcat, biting and scratching and hitting them with a wooden stick. Finally, they were forced to release her and back away. Without a thought for her own safety, she raced into the burning tepee and almost at once emerged, dragging the Iroquois warrior to safety. The men of the village did not know how to respond to the old woman's courage. But before they could even begin to collect their thoughts, the courageous old woman collapsed onto the ground before them and died. The tremendous exertions of the morning had caused her heart to give out, and she died there in the sands by the ruins of her tepee. The people of the village gazed in silence at the result of their morning's work. The old woman was dead, perishing in her efforts to save their enemy. The Iroquois lay where the old woman had dragged him, still weak from his terrible wounds, tightly gripping his flintlock rifle, ready to protect himself one last time against his sworn mortal enemies. Finally, the Ojibwe chief stepped forward. He knelt beside the warrior and the body of the old woman, his mother-in-law. Carefully he removed the rifle from his enemy's hands. His people nodded in understanding, expecting that the chief would quickly end the life of the Iroquois, but instead he stooped down and lifted the injured man into his arms. With great tenderness he carried the warrior to his own tepee, and in the weeks that followed, he nursed the man back to health. The courage of the old woman was spoken of by my people throughout the generations from that time to this, Wes said, and the small baby that the Iroquois warrior had saved from certain death grew to be our most celebrated chief, my great-great-great-grandfather. Many weeks later, the Iroquois warrior recovered and was allowed to return to his village in the south. And what is remarkable is that from that time forward, never again was the village attacked by the Iroquois, and it was all because of the courage and determination of one old woman. The others were quiet for a moment as they considered Wes's remarkable story. "You know," Martha Martin finally said, "it does remind me of a more familiar story, especially the part of how the old woman was willing to die for her enemy." Wes smiled over at Mrs. Martin. "I wondered if you'd see the parallel. My grandfather told me that the story reminded him of what the Lord Jesus Christ did for us. He said that we are like the Iroquois warrior, strangers and enemies, and yet Jesus willingly died for us so that we could spend eternity with him." Mrs. Martin nodded her head. "And the end result was the same for us as it was for the Iroquois and the Ojibwe." The others looked up at her. "Peace," she finally said. "In our case, peace with God." Isaac looked over at his cousin. Eric was gazing intently at Mrs. Martin, a troubled expression lining his face. The Baldwin by night. The great horned owl peered down from its perch high atop the jack-pine, its tiny kingdom once again the scene of late-night activity. Lights bobbed eerily between the building and a truck which was parked nearby. The bird turned its head to the river as a canoe slipped silently onto the shoreline, and a lone canoeist stepped from the craft. It was an old man with a great white head of hair and a long beard. The man ducked behind a large juniper bush at the edge of the clearing, then eased his way toward the lights. Staying close behind the bush, the old man stared into the blackness. Then he nodded. Behind the building was the bulky black shadow of a truck. "Let's get some light here," a voice called from the darkness. All at once the night was split by the headlights of the truck. The brilliant beam shone into the face of the head frame, and in its glow 2 men began unloading a couple of large steel barrels, carrying them into the mine building. The old man watched them with intense interest as the great horned owl stirred in the shelter of the pine, stepped from its perch, then glided silently into the blackness of the night. Chapter 6. Shubel Pays a Visit. With a deafening roar, the Cessna 180 bushplane turned its nose and taxied the final 100 yards across the lake to the Calder's dock. Eric and Isaac stood on the end of the pier with Donna Partridge, watching as the pilot cut the engine and expertly guided the plane so that it drifted gently into the dock. Only a faint breeze from the west disturbed the early morning waters of Lake Kenogami. "You're using the plane to do a wolf check?" Eric asked Donna Partridge as they secured the plane to the end of the pier. The conservation officer nodded. "I doubt if we'll have much luck, though. Spotting wild animals from a plane is much easier to do during the winter when the leaves are off the trees. I still don't think any wolves have been stealing bear bait in the area, Isaac said. Those tracks near the bear hunter's platform were made by something, Donna said. Just then a large, balding man with a green leather jacket swung open the door of the Cessna and stepped down onto the dock. "Morning, Miss Partridge," he said. "Good day, Grant," Donna replied. "Good to see you again." She shook the pilot's hand. "Grant, I'd like you to meet a couple of friends of mine, Eric and Isaac Calder. Eric's family owns this resort." The pilot shook the boy's hands, then turned back to Donna. "Any chance I can get a coffee before we head out? I was burning the midnight oil getting this old tub ready for the trip." "Sure," Eric said. "My mom just put on a fresh pot." "Why don't we have our coffee out here?" Donna said, pointing to a picnic table under a spreading willow tree. "It's too nice to go inside." "Great idea," Eric agreed. "Have a seat. I'll go in and get the coffee." When Eric returned, Isaac and the others were seated comfortably around the rustic table. "So," the pilot said, wrapping both hands around his steaming mug, "we're looking for wolves, are we?" Donna nodded, her eyes brightening. "There's been a report of wolves in the area. I thought it would be a good idea to take a look from up there." "Sure," the pilot agreed. "Never tried to spot wolves from the air before, although we do it every year for moose. Too much vegetation during the summer to see much, though, and wolves usually do their running at night." "I want to scout this area anyway," Donna said. "I need to get a better lay of the land around Kenogami, see if there is any activity going on that maybe shouldn't be." "Fine," Grant said agreeably. "You'll be the one with her eye on her ground. I'll be occupied keeping that old crate in the air." He laughed when he noticed the frown that creased Donna's face. "Oh, don't worry. That plane's as reliable as the 10 o'clock news." There was a break in the conversation for a moment as they gazed out over the still surface of Lake Kenogami. A lone canoe had appeared and was making a line for the Calder's dock. "That looks like Shubel Chase," Isaac said. "The hermit we met yesterday." Eric nodded. "It sure is. I wonder what he's up to." Eric and Isaac rose from the picnic table as the old man pulled his canoe up on the beach in front of the lodge. "Morning, Mr. Chase," Isaac said. Their guest dropped wearily into a nearby lawn chair. "Morning, folks." "Want a coffee?" Eric asked. "No thanks, boy. My mom just went into Kirkland Lake to visit my dad in the hospital." Shubel grunted. "I did hear that your dad was laid up with a busted leg." He sat silently for a minute while the others stared at him. Finally, he turned to Grant. "You the pilot of that plane?" Grant nodded. "I'm here to take Miss Partridge up this morning to look for wolves." "Wolves, eh? Instead of looking for wolves, you government people should be checking things over at the Baldwin." The old man looked from the pilot to Donna. "Something strange is going on there at night." Isaac sat a little straighter as Shubel Chase's words sank in. "Something strange?" Donna finally asked. "What exactly?" "I went by there late last night. It was really late, after midnight. A truck was parked by the head frame and a couple of men were unloading barrels. I checked things out after they left, but they'd locked the place up tight." The pilot shrugged. "So what? Probably just storing some supplies there." "Well, maybe so," Shubel said. "But why do they do their work in the middle of the night? And another thing, the fish around the mine are dying. Maybe there's a connection with what's being stored in the old building and the fish dying the way they are." "What could be in those barrels that would do that?" Isaac asked. "Chemicals or toxins of some kind," Donna offered. "Gold mines use a lot of poisonous materials in their refining process." "But why would they be storing things in a mine that's been abandoned for over 50 years?" Eric asked. The old man pushed back from the table, his small dark eyes blazing. "That's what we got to find out," he said, banging the picnic table with his fist. "If enough poison is leaking into the river to kill our fish, what else is it doing? People like me depend on the Blanche for their drinking water. We've got to find out what's going on and put a stop to it." Donna got to her feet. "I sent one of those dead fish to our lab to see if they can determine what killed it. I should have the results in the next day or two. I'll let you know as soon as I find out. In the meantime, I'll do some digging around to see if I can uncover who could be storing stuff at the mine. Maybe new owners have taken over the property." Shubel Chase shook his head in exasperation, then turned to Eric. "When you see your dad, tell him I was asking about him." "I sure will, Mr. Chase." He glanced down at his watch. "Well, we'd better get to work," he said. "My mother left us quite a list of things to finish before she gets home." Shubel Chase rose wordlessly to his feet and started down the path to the lake. Suddenly he turned. "If you happen to see your renegade friend Wes, tell him I'm gonna start charging him next time he brings tourists by for a visit." "You don't have to worry about that, Mr. Chase," Isaac said with a laugh. "Jesse's barge sank last night. Wes is over there right now trying to refloat it." The old man grinned, then turned and slowly made his way back down the path to his canoe. Eric shook his head. "Boy, old Shubel must really be upset to come down here and let us know about the goings-on at the Baldwin. He usually likes to keep to himself." The pilot got to his feet. "Well, we'd better get going, Miss Partridge. Let's see if we can find us some wolves." The witness. A light breeze from the west blew in from the woods and through the branches of the tall jack pine. The great horned owl edged its way farther along a branch and leaned forward to get a better look at the scene below. Two men were once again transporting steel barrels from a truck into the mine building. The owl turned its head toward the river, attracted by another, fainter sound. In the pale starlight, another intruder beached his canoe and edged his way through the screen of bushes lining the riverfront. The latest interloper paused for a moment behind a hedge of alder trees, silently observing the men who were working at the mine building. Suddenly, a figure loomed in the darkness directly behind the silent observer. A large, blunt instrument rose, then fell with a sickening thud on the head of the watcher. The stricken man staggered several steps forward under the force of the blow and then collapsed to his knees, shaking his head. The attacker sprang forward and raised the club high in the air. In the instant before the weapon came crashing down a second time, its victim spun round and lunged at the attacker, clawing at his assailant in the darkness. The club thudded down once again, sending the man sprawling to the earth. The assailant looked down at the still form of his victim, then turned and threw the large stick far out into the river. As he did so, another man joined him, kneeling over the prone body. "I think you killed him." High above them in the pine, the great horned owl stepped back into the shadows of the branches, pulled its head down into its chest feathers, and settled in for the night. Chapter 7. Back to the Baldwin. Eric set the heavy wheelbarrow load of rocks down on the beach and watched while Isaac placed a particularly large stone in the break wall. "I think that load ought to do it," Isaac said. "Dump it down here." He pointed to a spot by his feet. "My dad will be happy to see this job done when he gets out of the hospital." Eric tipped the load onto the beach. "It's looking good, isn't it?" Isaac said, admiring the 15-foot length of rock wall. "It should keep that old willow from being washed out in the spring." He winced as he pressed against a large blister that had formed on the palm of his hand. The roar of a high-powered outboard engine turned his head back to the lake. "Wes!" He glanced quickly down at his wristwatch. "We finished just in time." "Looks like he has someone with him," Eric said, as they made their way down to the dock. "Is that Jesse?" He shielded his eyes from the afternoon sun to get a better look at the second person in Wes's boat. "Now why would Wes be bringing Jessie along on our fishing trip?" Isaac asked. Wes cut the engine, then wheeled the prow of the boat so that it settled with a noisy flourish against the rubber tires at the dock's end. Jessie sat serenely in the prow, a long, brightly coloured dress decorating her large frame. Her straight black hair was cropped collar-length and stuck out from under a straw hat. Help an old woman. She rose cautiously to her feet, the boat wobbling precariously. Eric and Isaac quickly moored the boat to the dock, then helped Jessie out of the bobbing craft. Jessie stood on the end of the dock, a bent stick in her right hand. Carefully she smoothed her colourful dress and patted down her cropped-off hair. Wes stepped from the boat, his eyes large with excitement. "We're in for a bit of luck today. Jessie agreed to come with us." Isaac gave Wes a curious blank look while Jessie eyed them suspiciously. "Wes told me that you boys could hold your tongues." "Hold our tongues?" Eric repeated. She edged closer to the Calders. "This old woman has got a deep spot in the river where the pickerel bite. Big pickerel." Isaac stared. "Really?" Jessie turned her head slightly and gazed from Isaac to his cousin. Her great fleshy eyelids seemed almost closed, giving her a strange, mysterious look. A loud thump from the other end of the pier brought Isaac back to reality. Gallagher, the newspaper reporter, was heading down the dock toward them, a huge camera bag swinging from his neck. He had a mini cassette recorder held to his mouth and was dictating something into it. "Ah, don't worry," Isaac said quickly. "That's Gallagher. We're dropping him off at the Baldwin Mine. He wants to get some pictures for his newspaper." "The life and death of a gold mine," Wes added dramatically. "Hello, Shakespeare," he shouted as Gallagher approached. The old woman nodded her head cautiously. "Don't say nothing to him about my fishing spot." Gallagher, Eric and Isaac helped Jessie into her seat in the prow, then wedged themselves into the middle portion of the boat. Wes readjusted the pile of life-preservers, fishing poles, cans of bait, and other assorted paraphernalia around his 4 passengers. Isaac turned and glanced back at the shoreline. Sarah had appeared and was standing under a willow tree, waving at the departing boat. He felt a pang of regret as the girl receded from sight. "I sure appreciate you fellas taking me as far as the old mine," Gallagher shouted above the roar of the engine. "No problem," Wes shouted back. "We're going right by there anyway." The passengers ducked their heads as they swept under a bridge and started down the Blanche River. Isaac could tell that Gallagher was just itching to continue the conversation. "I've never seen an abandoned mine up close," Gallagher shouted. He patted the large camera bag at his side. "I should be able to get some great shots. It's a perfect day." Jessie gave the tall, thin man one of her unfathomable looks. The 75-horsepower motor sped full bore down the meandering waterway, some of it not much wider than a 4-lane highway. Despite Isaac's reservations, Wes maintained the same breakneck speed all the way to the Baldwin Mine. "There she is!" Wes shouted as they rounded a long, sweeping bend. He cut the throttle and guided the boat skillfully into shore. Several dead perch were still floating on their backs by the edge of the river. "Pick me up on your way back," Gallagher said, scooping up his camera bag and hopping into the shallow water. Wes nodded. "I doubt if we'll be able to fit you in for all the fish we're going to catch, but we ought to be back in a couple of hours. Is that enough time?" Gallagher's narrow head bobbed up and down. "More than enough." Isaac jammed a paddle into the riverbed to push the boat away from shore when he was stopped by a sudden shout from Wes. "Wait!" Wes was standing in the boat's stern, pointing to a spot a few feet from the shoreline. "What's that lying on the ground over by those bushes?" "It looks like a body," Isaac said, the alarm showing in his voice. He followed Eric over the side of the boat while Wes secured it to a nearby poplar tree. In a small clump of juniper bushes lay the crumpled form of a man lying on his back, one arm thrown across his face. Isaac recognized him immediately. "Shubel!" Jessie scrambled from the boat. Pushing past the boys, she dropped to her knees and felt Shubel's wrist for a pulse. For one terrible instant, Isaac thought the old man was dead. Crusted blood covered the side of his face and his forehead. His eyes were closed, and his complexion a ghastly white. For almost 15 seconds, Jessie knelt in the pine needles holding Shubel's wrist and studying his ashen face. Gallagher stepped anxiously from one foot to the other, every so often raising his camera and snapping a picture of the proceedings. Finally, Jessie lifted her head and gave a slight nod. "Get my canteen." Isaac sprinted to the boat and returned with the canteen of water. By the time he got back, they already had Shubel propped against an old stump. Jessie pulled a kerchief from her pocket, soaked it with water, then dampened the forehead of the injured man. Shubel didn't stir, but Isaac was relieved to note that as the blood was washed from the injured man's face, he began to appear less frightful-looking. Jessie set down the canteen and lifted Shubel's eyelid, studying his eyeball intently. "We'll see if he'll take any water." She held the canteen up to Shubel's mouth and gently poured a trickle between his lips. There was a brief pause. Then the old man coughed violently. His eyes flew open and he looked wildly around him. Isaac jumped back from the suddenness of Shubel's actions. The old hermit blinked rapidly, then tried to push himself up from the stump. He groaned softly and fell back. "What happened?" he whispered. "That's what we were wondering," Eric said. Shubel rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand. "I don't know." He sat still for a moment or two, his eyes closed. "I remember coming here late last night to check on things. A truck was parked at the mine and a couple of men were unloading barrels. I crept through the bush as close as I could to see what was going on when—" The old man stopped and looked down at his right hand, a puzzled expression creasing his wrinkled face. "What's this?" He opened his hand and lifted it up for the others to see. Jessie picked the contents from his grip and held them up to the sunlight. Pinched between her pudgy fingers was a simple piece of blue plaid cloth. Jessie turned it over and drew it closer to her nearsighted eyes. A flat wad of paper was stuck to the cloth. "Pack of matches," Isaac said. He picked the booklet from Jessie's hand and turned it over. It was small and silver-coloured, with a dark red inscription on the front. "Those are from the resort," Eric said in surprise. "See?" He pointed to the name of the Calder's resort inscribed in bold lettering across the front. "What about the piece of cloth?" Gallagher asked. "Where did it come from?" Everyone's attention turned to the piece of blue plaid still pinched between Jessie's fingers. "Someone's shirt pocket," Shubel Chase said, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked up at the faces clustered about him. "It's coming back to me," he said slowly. "I remember crouching behind those bushes when I heard a sound behind me. As I turned to see what it was, someone hit me hard over the top of my head. I could feel myself going under, but I managed to reach out and grab something. Whoever slugged me is now missing the front pocket of his shirt." Isaac looked back down at the plaid piece of cloth. "It looks like a pocket from one of those bush shirts." "And whoever it was is also missing a pack of matches," Isaac added. Eric looked thoughtfully at the matches. "The guy must have been staying at our resort." "Yeah," Wes said. "Maybe he's still staying there." Isaac let the thought percolate in his head for a moment, a wave of uneasiness settling over him. "We'd better get you to a doctor, Shubel. Let him have a look at that head of yours." With the help of the boys, Jessie hauled Shubel to his feet and guided him down to the boat. "No pictures of the mine or fishing today," Gallagher said sadly as they pushed away from the shoreline and started back for Kenogami. Chapter 8. Contaminated. Isaac stood in the middle of the small cluster of people watching as the lights of the ambulance disappeared down the road to town. "He'll be all right," Aunt Helga assured everyone as she led the group back down the trail to the lodge. "When we visit Dad in the hospital this evening, we can check on how Shubel's doing as well," Eric suggested. "That's a good idea," his mother agreed. "But in the meantime, let's get some lunch." Wes, Sarah, and Martha Martin, Gallagher, Donna Partridge, and Jessie followed the Calders up to the lodge porch. The long, screened-in room offered a spectacular view of Lake Kenogami, its beautiful dark waters stretching far to the north and west. As soon as everyone was seated around the table, Helga Calder brought a large platter of sandwiches in from the kitchen. "I'm surprised the police aren't here yet," Wes said. Helga took her place at the end of the table. "The dispatcher on the phone said it might take them an hour or more to get here. I guess they're understaffed this summer." She glanced over to Mrs. Martin. "Martha, would you mind saying grace for us?" The old woman nodded agreeably, then bowed her head. "We thank Thee, Lord, for the provisions which you have so generously bestowed, and for the hands that prepared it. We commit Mr. Chase to your tender care at this time, thanking Thee that his injuries were no more severe than they are. May he feel Thy presence even now as we remember him to Thee. Amen." The others chorused their amens. The relaxed atmosphere of the luncheon was just what Isaac needed. The tension of the morning's activities and the nagging, anxious thoughts of his parents slowly dissolved, sped on their way by Wes's high-spirited rendition of the sinking of Jessie's barge. When the conversation lagged, Isaac's thoughts again turned to his parents, far away in the city, now not even living under the same roof anymore. He finally excused himself from the table, feeling a terrible heaviness clutch at his heart. The cool breeze off the lake felt good on his face as he exited the porch and walked slowly across the yard. Perhaps he should return home. There he might be able to help his parents patch things up. "I'll bet you're wishing you were home now." Isaac spun around at the unexpected voice. Wes was standing there, his dark eyes serious for once. Isaac nodded. "You guessed it." Wes led the way down to the sandy beach, and together they stood looking out over the peaceful waters of Lake Kenogami. "Do you really think God cares about my problems?" Isaac asked, his voice catching ever so slightly. "Sometimes I don't think so." Wes shrugged. "It probably doesn't seem like it right now, does it? I've been reading my Bible, Wes, and praying, yet it just seems like I'm not getting through. I remember my grandfather saying once that one of the most important lessons he ever learned about life was perseverance during times of trouble. He compared it to being out in a wild blizzard in the middle of winter. He said, all we can do is just tuck our head down and follow the compass." Wes smiled at his friend. "And keep doing what you're doing." Just then, a blue and white police car pulled into the yard, and two uniformed officers emerged from the cruiser. Isaac and Wes hurried up from the beach and met them at the lodge door. Aunt Helga and Donna Partridge were already waiting on the porch, both looking nervously at the approaching visitors. "We've been expecting you," Aunt Helga said. The police officers wore the tan-coloured everyday uniforms of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the first officer's sleeves decorated with the two stripes of a corporal. "Afternoon," the corporal said, tipping his hat. "My name is Corporal Jessup. This is my partner, Constable Anderson." "I was expecting the provincial police," Helga said. "They'll be questioning Mr. Chase in the hospital when he's up to it," Corporal Jessup explained. "We were asked to investigate the crime scene. Apparently they think there may be aspects of the case which could fall under our jurisdiction." Constable Anderson pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. "From the initial report it appears that Mr. Chase was assaulted at the Baldwin Mine, about 2 miles east on the Blanche River." "That's right," Helga answered. "Was he alone at the time?" "Now, if he was alone, how could he have been assaulted?" Wes asked with a grin. Helga gave Wes a dirty look, then smiled sheepishly at the two policemen. Shubel had grown suspicious of some late-night goings-on at the old mine, so he was keeping an eye on the place. "Do you have any idea what might have aroused his suspicions?" "Perhaps," Helga said. "You see, the Baldwin has been abandoned for years. Yet last night, Shubel witnessed several men unloading barrels into the headframe. And," Donna added, "we suspect that whatever is in those barrels is killing the fish around the mine site." Corporal Jessup looked around him curiously. "Is there someone here who can take us down to the mine?" "We'll take you," Isaac offered. "We've got a motorboat and know the way." The police officer nodded. "Can we leave now?" "You bet." Helga drew in a shaky breath and glanced nervously at her son. "I'm coming too," Wes said, "and I'm bringing Jessie. No one is better at reading signs than her." He glanced at the two policemen. "She may come in handy." "I'd like to come along too," Donna Partridge said. "I need answers as to why fish are dying in the waters by the mine. Maybe you gentlemen can help me uncover something we missed." The two Mounties glanced warily at the circle of people, but offered no objections. "Let's go," Isaac urged. "Wes, you'd better take your boat too. We can't all fit in ours." The brilliant afternoon sun beat down on the two power boats as they swept down the Blanche River. The two Mounties were seated in the middle portion of Eric's boat, with Isaac in the prow. Wes, Jessie and Donna Partridge followed close behind in Wes's sleek speedboat. It wasn't long before they rounded the final bend and beached in the shadow of the tall head frame of the Baldwin. They were led ashore by Eric. "This is where he was lying," Eric said, pointing to the juniper bushes between the two birch trees. Corporal Jessup drew a plastic bag from his pocket and produced the piece of shirt and pack of matches taken from Shubel. "Apparently this was in the old man's hand when you found him," the officer said. He opened the package and re-examined the evidence while his partner scoured the ground around them. "We tried not to trample things," Isaac assured them, sitting down on a stump just outside the clearing. He watched Jessie edging her way up from the shoreline. Donna Partridge, meanwhile, stood in the shallows of the river, staring intently down at a dead perch. "Look at this!" Donna pointed to the water at her feet. A thin film of green extended out into the river for about 6 or 7 feet. "Well, one thing is for sure. It's not algae." She filled a small plastic container with the water. "Another job for the lab." Jessie slowly eased her way through the undergrowth up to the Baldwin Mine. Eyes lowered to the ground, she inched her way across a cluttered forest floor, her colourful dress blowing lightly in the breeze off the river. Every now and then she would stop, get down on one knee, and sift through the twigs and debris. She would then rise to her feet and continue her methodical journey up to the mine building. Isaac and the others followed the old woman, each examining the ground that Jessie had so carefully searched. Isaac could see nothing but brush, packed muddy earth, old boards and bits of junk that lay scattered around the site. Finally, at the mine building, Jessie stopped. As the policeman approached the old woman, she nodded toward the building. 3 men were here with Shubel last night. If it hadn't rained, I could tell you more." Corporal Jessup raised his eyebrows doubtfully as Jessie continued. "The trail of poison begins here." She indicated the building in front of them. "Are you sure?" one of the policemen asked. Wes pointed back down to the river. "Something has to be killing those fish," he said. "That's why Shubel came here last night. He thought the mine was being used to store toxins that are draining into the river." "What company owns this mine?" Constable Anderson asked. Wes shrugged. "Don't know. It's been out of operation for years. We'll have to run a check on that." Corporal Jessup walked over to the front door of the building and tried the handle. "It's open. Giving the door a gentle push, it swung inward with a rusty creak. "I'm sure I saw a big padlock on that door the last time we were here," Wes said. The corporal stepped forward and opened the door all the way, revealing an interior as black as a moonless night. "Better be careful," Wes said. "These abandoned headframes are supposed to have their shafts capped so no one can accidentally fall in, but sometimes they're not. There may be an uncapped shaft just inside the door." Corporal Jessup turned and looked at Wes. "You say the door was locked yesterday?" "It sure was," Wes said. "I remember being surprised at the size of the padlock." "Then why did someone leave such a dangerous building unlocked?" Constable Anderson asked. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt and flipped it on, but the light did little to illuminate the coal-black interior. A small, square vent high above their heads was the only other source of light. The building was dark, hollow, and eerily silent. A slight shuffling sound stirred high in the darkness above them. "Bats," Wes muttered. "Where are the barrels?" Isaac asked. "Shubel saw them moving barrels in here." "Maybe they were moving barrels out of the building," Wes suggested. "Or dumping the contents of the barrels down the shaft," Corporal Jessup suggested. "What's that?" Donna Partridge whispered, pointing to a spot about 10 feet in front of them. The policeman swept his flashlight in the direction indicated, revealing a large black hole about the size of an elevator shaft. A pile of planks lay scattered in a heap by the gaping chasm. "Stay away from there," Wes warned. "It's maybe about a half-mile straight down." "Possibly," Constable Anderson agreed. "Or it could be filled with water and all sorts of junk. Mine shafts have a tendency to cave in over time." He took a step toward the hole. "Everyone stay well back." They inched their way across the room, Isaac staying close behind the lead policeman. "There's one way to tell how deep it is." Wes eased even closer to the mine shaft and tossed a fist-sized rock into the hole. Almost immediately they heard a splash. "It's full of water," Eric exclaimed. "Well, we're going to have to get a team in here to find out if toxins are being dumped down that hole," Corporal Jessup said with a shake of his head. Jessie pushed past the Mounties and moved up to the edge of the shaft. She eased herself down onto one knee, motioning for the flashlight to be shone on the ground in front of her. Carefully she picked up a handful of sand and held it up to the light. Isaac and the others leaned forward for a better look. Even in the dim glow of the flashlight, they could all see the faint traces of a green powder among the grains of sand. "It looks the same as the green powder we saw in the river," Isaac said. Jessie nodded her head. "Poison." Chapter 9. Trapped. The two Mounties climbed the front steps of the lodge and were met at the door by Aunt Helga. Their host had changed into a light-coloured summer dress and had taken her dark hair down from its usual bun. Wes, Eric and Isaac joined them by the door. "We've questioned all your guests," Corporal Jessup informed them. "It seems that they are all able to corroborate their whereabouts last night. Of course, the assault on Mr. Chase happened when most people were sound asleep in bed. We've told your guests to stay close at hand for the next few days. If any of them check out, please notify us at once." He handed Helga a business card. "One other thing. An investigative team will be sent in to take a closer look at the mine site. In the meantime, we'll be touching base with the provincial police to see if they found out anything from Mr. Chase." "Thank you for all your help," Aunt Helga said. "It's been a very stressful summer, and it doesn't seem to be improving." "We'll get to the bottom of it," the corporal reassured her. "We always do." Aunt Helga nodded wearily as she and the boys said their goodbyes and watched as the police officers drove away in their cruiser. With a soft moan, she collapsed into a wicker chair and buried her face in her apron. Eric put his hand on his mother's shoulder. After a moment, she wiped her face, straightened up and let out a long, quivering breath. Isaac looked questioningly at the other two boys. Wes cleared his throat. I found out this morning that 2 of your neighbours are selling out. Aunt Helga looked up. Selling out? Henderson's and the Shady Willow, Wes explained. It seems that your guest, Jack Gray, bought them both out yesterday. Now he only needs the land your resort is on to set his casino plans in motion. Aunt Helga slapped her hand down on the arm of the chair and got to her feet. I'm selling out too, she said. I can't take this anymore. When I was visiting Jim in the hospital this morning, his doctor told us that he may never be able to walk properly again. She turned to her son. It's just one thing after another. How will we be able to keep up with this place if your dad has only one good leg? It was hard enough when he was healthy and working 12 hours a day. But now, her voice faded. We'll be all right, Eric said sympathetically. You can't give up now, Mom. Isaac can come up and help out when we're busy in the summers. Don't sell out, Mom. Wait until Dad gets home and then we'll decide. No, Aunt Helga said firmly. Your dad and I have already talked about this enough. I'm speaking to Mr. Gray as soon as I can. I've had enough. I want to move back down south to the city and lead a normal life. I want to live in the suburbs and shop at a mall. I want to go out in the evening to a concert and see all my old friends again. She wiped the tears from her face. I'm just tired of all this. Isaac looked at his 2 friends. His aunt's dismay was something he'd never expected, and the thought of Eric's family moving back to the city turned his heart into a giant block of ice. He could see the look of anguish on his cousin's face. Eric loved this place. The screen door behind Aunt Helga banged open, and Donna Partridge entered with Sarah Martin. Aunt Helga looked up and gave them an embarrassed wave. Don't mind me. I just need a good night's sleep. She disappeared into the kitchen. Sarah looked questioningly at the boys, then followed Aunt Helga out of the room. Is now a good time to show you something? Donna asked. Isaac recovered first. Sure. He ushered Donna over to the dining room table. Did you spot any wolves yesterday? Nothing, Donna said, carefully spreading a map out on the table before them. I need you to look at something. See this little lake? She pointed to a spot just north of Kenogami. Wes nodded. Wildwood Lake. Can we get there by boat? Wes shook his head. There's only a shallow creek joining Kenogami and Wildwood. I guess you could hike back in there, but it would probably take 2 or 3 hours. Your best bet is to go by ATV. There's a trail back in there, then? There's trails leading everywhere up here, if you know where to look. Would you be able to take me back to Wildwood Lake this afternoon? Wes glanced down at his watch and gave his customary shrug. Sure. It's only 3 o'clock and it's not that far. Sarah re-entered the dining room just then and crossed over to the table. Your mother's lying down, she said to Eric. She just needs a rest. Thanks. Why do you want to go back to Wildwood Lake, Donna? Isaac asked. There's nothing much there. The fishing's not even that good at this time of year. When I was up in the plain yesterday, I noticed something near the lake that looked peculiar. She bent over the map and pointed to a narrow peninsula jutting into the western end of the small body of water. The area near this point of land looked like it had some serious exploration work going on. There's not supposed to be any mineral exploration in this region, is there? Wes asked. Donna shook her head. I had a feeling I'd need an all-terrain vehicle to get back in there to take a look, so I had one dropped off this morning. I know you boys have a couple of machines. Could you take me back in there? Wes glanced down at his watch, then at the Calders and Sarah. It's only about a 45-minute trip. What do you think? Eric looked uncomfortably around at his friends. Wes, you're going to have to come by tomorrow and help us get caught up on our work. My mother's already getting stressed out. Wes flexed his muscles playfully. Agreed. Isaac knew that the sleek 4-wheeled ATV was his cousin's pride and joy. Eric's dad had purchased it that spring to use around the resort, and both boys had used the machine a number of times on the many wilderness trails surrounding Lake Kenagami. Isaac loved the solitude of the forest and the reviving effect the rides had on him after a hard day's work. The fact that Eric willingly agreed to let Isaac drive the machine back to Wildwood Lake was a mild surprise. He gave his cousin a wink as Eric jumped onto the back of Wes's beat-up yellow and green four-wheeler, and Sarah climbed on behind Isaac. The 3 ATVs formed a small convoy of vehicles, with Wes and Eric in the lead. Donna took up the second position, with Isaac and Sarah bringing up the rear. The hard-packed trail back to Wildwood Lake was especially memorable, winding through some of the prettiest country in northern Ontario. Great forests of tall spruce and jack pine stretched for miles in every direction. Despite the deafening roar of the engines, their meandering route had a lulling effect on the travellers, so that their arrival at Wildwood Lake seemed to catch them by surprise. It was a much smaller lake than Kenagami. Isaac estimated that a good motorboat would probably take less than a minute to cross from one end to the other, and from what he knew about such northern lakes, it was probably quite shallow as well. "I thought you said there was some exploration work around here," Wes remarked, glancing around them. "It should be just west of that point of land," Donna said, dismounting from her ATV and leading them past a rocky protrusion extending out into the lake. "The underbrush in the north is really thick, isn't it?" Sarah said, as they left the trail. "It's hard to imagine that anyone has ever passed through this area before." Isaac grinned, helping her scale an abrupt rock face. "You're doing great." They'd gone no more than another 100 yards when they stepped into a wide clearing that had been bulldozed clean of all topsoil and vegetation. A deep trench stretched almost the entire length of the bulldozed area. "Wow," Eric said, stepping into the clearing. "What happened here?" "Nothing like this should be happening anywhere near here," Donna said. "The work is obviously fairly recent, and this entire area is restricted to exploration of any kind." "I guess someone didn't read the rules," Wes said. Sarah gave Isaac an uneasy glance. "Surely no one's still here," she said quietly. "Oh, I don't think so," Donna said. "It looks abandoned, at least temporarily. Let's take a closer look at that trench and see what they're up to." The small party skirted the pile of dirt heaped in front of them, then stood gazing down into the deep chasm. It was the width of a one-lane highway and about 8 feet deep with a bottom of grey bedrock. "They must have brought a bulldozer in here to get down to the bedrock," Wes said. Donna slid to the bottom of the trench and worked her way slowly along the outcropping of granite, studying the surface. "Look at this," she finally said, holding up a grey cylindrical object about a foot in length and the diameter of a broom handle. "This is a core sample from a diamond drill. There's a whole bunch of them down here." She looked up at Sarah. "An exploration company drills deep holes in the bedrock so they can test the mineral content. Whoever was working this spot went to a lot of trouble and expense. They must have high hopes for developing a mine in this area, no matter what laws are being broken." "Why didn't they fill in the trench and clean things up?" Isaac asked. Donna shook her head. "I don't know, unless they're not finished. Whatever they're up to, though, they're gambling big time." She climbed back up the bank and stood looking around her. "Is this the only trench?" Eric asked. "That's all I could see from the plane." "They may be waiting for their drilling results before planning their next move," Wes suggested. "Maybe they'll dig another trench, do some more drilling, see if this area has enough potential for a mine." "The workings are very fresh," Donna said, "certainly within the last week or two." She looked over at Wes. "How would they have gotten their heavy machinery in here, their bulldozers and diamond drilling equipment?" "There must be a skid road around here somewhere," Wes said, scanning the wall of trees surrounding the clearing. "Let's take a look," Donna suggested. "Perhaps we can follow their trail back to its source and find out who is responsible for this." Wes pointed to what looked like a gap in the trees at the far end of the trench. "I'll bet that's the road." The opening in the trees was narrow and extremely rough. Isaac shook his head doubtfully. How could they even get an ATV through there? "I guess this is all the road they need," Wes said. "They'd just drive their bulldozer in here, pulling whatever other equipment they need." A sudden sense of foreboding washed through Isaac. Something was dreadfully wrong. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "The quiet," Isaac whispered. Absolute silence had descended on their little place in the wilderness. "Something's wrong." He could feel his eyes widen as he saw a thin pillar of smoke materialize before him, rolling from the treetops to the south. Even as he watched, the cloud of smoke grew in size. "Forest fire," Wes said. Chapter 10. Fire. For a moment Isaac stared at the skyline, gazing in disbelief at the growing cloud of smoke. "It's blocking the trail out of here," Sarah said. "The bikes!" Wes turned and sprinted across the clearing and into the woods. Isaac managed to catch Wes just as they arrived back at their ATVs. "Shouldn't we try to put out the fire?" "Too late. Besides, we have nothing to fight it with." He hopped onto his machine and started the engine. "Drive your ATVs right out into the lake," he shouted as the others piled onto their machines. "We'll go as far as we can. The lake's not very deep. We should be safe from the fire there." With Eric settled in behind him, Wes wheeled his yellow and green ATV down the bank and into the shallow water of Wildwood Lake. "Go slowly. We can't let the motors get wet," he shouted over his shoulder, "or we'll never get them started again." 100 feet from shore, the water was still only halfway up the large wheels of the ATVs. Wes pulled his machine into a tight loop, then turned off the ignition. The other two vehicles rolled in beside him, so that the three machines were lined up facing back toward the shore. Great billows of smoke now rolled above the trees in front of them. "If the fire gets too close, we may have to leave our machines and wade further out into the lake," Wes said. "How do you think it got started?" Sarah asked. "Someone must have set it," Donna replied. "Forest fires are usually started by either lightning or careless people." "But who'd be back here to start a fire?" Eric asked. An uneasy quiet fell over the small group as they watched the smoke rolling over the forest. Here and there, the flicker of flames could be seen leaping above the treetops. Eric looked over at Sarah. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay. I was just praying." Eric laughed nervously. "That might not be such a bad idea." "I wish I'd brought my cell phone," Donna said. "I could call for help. This smoke is getting worse." She coughed and waved her hand in front of her face to help dissipate the thin layer of smoke that was now settling over the lake. "Oh, it won't take them long to spot that fire," Wes said. "The forestry station on Kenogami should have a water bomber here in no time at all." "We'll be safe out here, won't we?" Sarah asked. "I've read of people in forest fires who were suffocated by the smoke. They say it sucks the oxygen out of the air so that people can't breathe." "We should be all right out here," Isaac reassured her. "We can wet our shirts if we have to and breathe through them until the fire passes." "Let's hope so," Donna Partridge said in a low tone. "In the meantime, breathing may become a little uncomfortable." Isaac looked back over his shoulder at the body of water stretching out behind them. "How deep does this lake get, anyway? It sure looks shallow." Wes shrugged. "Not very deep. That's why it's such a great lake for catching pike in the spring. Pike love the warm, shallow waters." "I sure hope you aren't catching any pike during spawning season, young man," Donna Partridge said. "Of course not," Wes said with a laugh. "I always believe in giving the fish a sporting chance. Shubel Chase drilled that into me." Suddenly, they were aware of a faint humming sound from somewhere above them and to the east. "Plane," Wes said, pointing to a silver speck just above the trees on the eastern horizon. The speck grew ever larger until the single-engine plane was circling the lake at an altitude of no more than a couple of 100 feet. With a deafening roar, the aircraft swept directly over their heads, then banked sharply as it turned toward the rolling billows of smoke. As it passed above the trees at the south end of the lake, 2 doors on the plane's underside dropped open, and a great canopy of water exploded from its undercarriage. "Wow," Wes whistled through his teeth. "Will that be enough to put it out?" Sarah asked. "Not with just one passover," Wes said, "but it's a start. Watch." The plane made a wide turn far out on the western horizon, then roared back toward them, descending so rapidly that it seemed to almost touch the trees on the shoreline of the lake. The silver pontoons of the aircraft skimmed lightly across the surface of the lake for more than 100 yards before the pilot abruptly gunned his motor and the plane lifted off. "What's he doing?" Eric asked. "Keep watching," Wes said. "That pilot is really good. Wildwood is such a small lake that I thought he'd go back to Kenogami to pick up his water." The others glanced curiously at Wes, then back up at the bush plane. The aircraft had now cleared the trees on the far shore and was again banking in the direction of the forest fire. Ascending, the plane leveled off at no more than a couple of 100 feet above the fire. Then once again the trapdoor opened and water burst from the bottom of the plane. "What a pilot," Wes said, shaking his head in admiration. "That's what I'd like to do someday." For the next half hour, they sat on their ATVs watching the circling bushplane. Never did the aircraft falter in its routine, circling, picking up its load, taking off in a thundering roar, then dropping its load of water on the inferno. At the end of the half hour, the plane circled the area, dipped its wings, then vanished beyond the tops of the trees. "He must figure the fires out," Wes said. "But there's still so much smoke," Sarah said. The billowing clouds hovering over the area had now changed from a dark grey colour to pale white. "A firefighting crew will be sent in to mop up," Donna suggested. "They may already be in there, although I think they would probably run their fire hoses in from this lake." It was only then that Isaac became aware of how extremely uncomfortable he was, his shirt sticking to him and a film of smoke burning his lungs. "What should we do?" Sarah asked. "Is it safe to go home now?" Isaac was about to answer when he noticed a figure emerge from the forest in front of them, pause for a moment, then give them a beckoning wave. "Firefighters," Donna said, starting her machine. "You can tell by their gaudy orange uniforms." The fireman was tall, with a sandy-coloured beard and bright blue eyes, which seemed to blaze right through Isaac and the others. "Are you responsible for this mess?" he shouted above the noise of their ATVs as they approached him. "No, sir," Eric said, his eyes widening. "We first saw the smoke over beyond the trench." He pointed to where they had first seen the smoke and flames. Donna dismounted from her machine and approached the man. "My name's Donna Partridge," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a conservation officer." The firefighter stared stonily at her. Donna dropped her hand to her side. "Is the fire out?" The man nodded. "My men are over there looking for hot spots." "We didn't hear you come up," Isaac said. "How did you get here?" The man grunted. "Swamp buggy," he said. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and wrote something in it. "I need your names," he said gruffly. Once he had scrawled the information in his notebook, he turned and started back through the bush. He'd gone only a few feet when he stopped. "You'll be hearing from someone," he said. "Somebody started this fire, and you people are the likeliest candidates, conservation officer or not." Donna glared at the retreating firefighter. What a pompous man. "Well, one thing for sure, we know that we didn't start the fire. And that being the case, we have to ask ourselves not only who did start the fire, but why." Escape. The old owl stirred uncomfortably high on its branch in the jack pine. It bent its head down into its chest feathers for a moment to escape the uncomfortable wisps of smoke which still drifted past it on the warm evening breeze. It was much easier to breathe now than earlier in the evening. Then the smoke from the burning trees had been so thick that it was difficult to even see the ground below his perch. A faint rustling noise at the far edge of the forest drew the owl's attention. A large female moose and her gangly calf stepped quickly from the trees and trotted across the cleared area to the river. The owl's eyes grew wider as it watched the two huge creatures pass beneath it. At the river's edge, the two moose gazed fearfully back over their shoulders, then plunged into the river, driving awkwardly forward until the depth made it necessary for the two animals to swim the remainder of the distance to the far bank. The owl blinked once, then blinked again. Seeing the great moose pass beneath it on such an evening was not surprising. In the short time it had been in the branches of the jack pine, several large animals had already passed through the clearing to the safety of the far side of the river. The owl once again pushed its head down into its chest feathers and waited for the last uncomfortable wisps of smoke to dissipate. Chapter 11. The Sir Harry Oakes Chateau. Helga Calder studied the slip of paper in her hand, then looked up at her son and Isaac. Why would Shubel want to meet you boys at the museum, of all places? I'm surprised he's even out of the hospital, Isaac said, shaking his head. He must be doing better. The screen door to the kitchen banged open and Wes strode into the lodge. Eric waved Shubel's note at his friend. Shubel wants to meet us at the museum in Kirkland Lake this evening. Apparently he has something to show us. The museum, Wes said in surprise. Maybe he heard about the forest fire and wants to talk to us about it, Eric suggested. Helga Calder drew in a deep breath at the mention of the fire. You boys stay out of the bush for a while, at least until the police find out who set that fire. Eric gave his mom a hug, then followed his two friends outside and down the path to where their all-terrain vehicles were parked. Don't worry, Mom, Eric called out, strapping on his helmet. You can't get much safer than in a museum. Just be careful, his mother said. The Museum of Northern History was housed in a beautiful three-story mansion built decades earlier by the multi-millionaire mining magnate Sir Harry Oakes. Oakes had gained fame by being the discoverer of the richest gold strike in northern Canada, then had achieved even greater notoriety by being the victim of a world-famous unsolved murder. The museum's curator greeted the boys at the front door. Mr. Chase is upstairs in Nancy's room, she said. He's expecting you. Shubel was waiting in the small second-floor bedroom, seated in a rocking chair, his eyes partly closed. When the boys entered, the old hermit lifted his hand and gave them a tired wave. Thanks for coming, fellas. How are you feeling, Mr. Chase? Eric asked. The old man squinted up at the boys. I've got quite a headache, but other than that, I'm okay. Almost anything's better than being stuck in that hospital. No privacy whatsoever. He looked from one boy to the other, his face expressionless. I hear you fellas just missed being on the business end of a barbecue. Wes grinned. Almost, Shubel. Looks like someone was trying to discourage our nosiness. Shubel Chase swung his gaze past the boys to the wall behind them. Take a look at that wall, he said. The three boys turned to the white stucco wall behind them, edging closer for a better look. Eric rubbed the palm of his hand against the rough surface. Hey, pictures are engraved right into the plaster. You're right, Wes agreed, moving even closer to the wall. Here's a bird of some kind, and over here is a tree. Ever neat, Eric said. Sir Harry Oakes had this room especially done for his daughter Nancy, Shubel said. He brought this fella in from the city to do the work. Nice, huh? But you know what? I'll bet if I hadn't pointed it out, you might never have noticed. "Well, I sure hope Nancy appreciated all the fine artwork done for her amusement," Wes said. Shubel pushed his way out of the rocking chair and shuffled stiffly to the door. "Come here." He led them down the short hallway and into an area slightly larger than Nancy's room and was filled with stuffed wildlife. "Wow," Isaac said. "Look at this. A beaver, timber wolf, an owl." Shubel Chase knelt stiffly beside the beaver and began stroking the side of the animal's head. "I gave this little fella to the museum almost 10 years ago, marked a turning point in my life. At the time, it looked like the beaver might be completely exterminated from these parts. This little guy was the last one I took from my trap line, so I had him stuffed and sent him over here to add to the collection. I've never trapped or shot another wild creature since then." He continued to quietly stroke the beaver's head for a moment, then struggled to his feet. Without another word, he led them back down the corridor to his rocking chair in Nancy's room. Wes and the other boys dropped onto the floor in front of the old man and leaned back against the wall. "So why did you ask us to meet you here, Shubel?" Wes asked. "You need a lift home?" The old man nodded his head. "As a matter of fact, I do. I need to get home and feed my dog, but that's only part of the reason." He paused for a moment. "When you fellas came into this room, why didn't you notice the pictures on the wall?" Eric shrugged. "We'd never seen anything like that before." "You weren't looking," Shubel said emphatically. "That's the main reason." The boys looked at him curiously. "What I mean is that sometimes the most obvious things in life are right in front of our noses and we don't notice them." "Just what are you getting at, Shubel?" Wes asked. The old hermit leaned forward, resting on the arms of the rocking chair. "The Baldwin. We need to find out what's going on there, boys. There's some no-good characters creeping around in the middle of the night, doing goodness knows what." He pointed down the hall to the wildlife room. "This museum was put here to remind us of what a great country we live in, and that we have a responsibility to look after critters like that. And if that doesn't start to happen pretty soon, the only animals left will be in museums like this one. Now's our chance to make a bit of a difference, to give these poor creatures a hand." "But how are we supposed to find out what's going on at the Baldwin?" Isaac asked. "That's why I had you come here." Shubel leaned forward on the arms of the rocker, his eyes narrowing. "Whoever's storing stuff in the Baldwin is running scared. They were desperate enough to burn you fellas out and try to kill me, so we know this is a high-stakes game, whatever it is. Now, it's not likely they'll return to the Baldwin, but we've got to find out who it is that's behind all of this." He leaned back in the rocker and looked thoughtfully out the window. "Who do you think it was?" Isaac asked. "Don't know, boy," Shubel said with a grunt. "Right now, I haven't the slightest notion, but there is a way we may be able to find out." Wes stirred restlessly from his position on the floor. "How, Shubel? You got any bright ideas?" "I might have one, all right." As he looked at the boys, a trace of a smile appeared, buried deep in the wrinkles of his whiskered face. "Have the local newspapers got a hold of any of these goings-on?" "I imagine the forest fire will be in tomorrow's paper," Eric said, "but there's been nothing about the Baldwin or you being attacked." "Good. Do you think we can trust your newspaper friend, Gallagher?" The boys looked at one another. "I don't know," Isaac said. "We just met him this week." "He seems to be all right," Eric added cautiously. "Well, the doctors mentioned something interesting to me last night. I was lying in that hospital bed with all these tubes in me, and I was trying to recall the face of the guy who slugged me. I know it was dark, but something told me that I did get a look at him." The three boys looked at him in surprise. "Do you think you would recognize him if you saw him again?" Isaac asked. "Don't know. But the doctors did say that my memory of the attack would probably become clearer once the shock of the injury wears off. It's possible I might start to remember things in the next few days." "Do you remember the matches you tore from the attacker's pocket?" Wes asked. "Because they were from the Calder resort. The police think he must have stayed there at one time. They're going over a list of people who have rented cottages there during the past few weeks, and Eric's mom has to go into the police station tomorrow to look at some mugshots." Shubel nodded. "Do you think you could get Gallagher to write a story for his newspaper saying that I got a good look at the fella that beat me up? He could mention that the doctors expect that I may have a complete recollection within the next few days." "That would be kind of dangerous for you, wouldn't it?" Isaac asked. "We gotta flush them out, boy." Shubel struggled from the rocking chair, then leaned weakly against the closest wall. "What do you say? Will you do it?" "Shouldn't we let the police in on this?" Eric asked, getting to his feet. "They'll find out when it hits the paper," Shubel said emphatically. "The cops couldn't care less about a bit of poison leaking into some river in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, having the cops too close would just scare the bad guys off. If we're going to put a stop to these fellas, we're on our own." Wes put his hand on Shubel's shoulder. "We'll talk to Gallagher," he said. "Your idea just might get the ball rolling." He paused and looked straight into Shubel Chase's face. "One condition, though, old man. You'll be staying with us until all this blows over." He looked over at Eric. "Do you think your mom would mind?" Eric shook his head. "No, I think she'd see Mr. Chase as someone who just might keep the three of us out of trouble." The old man broke into a broad smile. "Tell you what, Wes, if you go over to my place and feed my dog, you've got a deal. Anyway, I could sure use some of Mrs. Calder's home cooking." Chapter 12. Headquarters. Gallagher took a step back from the small circle of people gathered before him. "You're telling me that Shubel Chase got a look at the guy that slugged him the other night?" "That's right," Wes said. "The doctors believe his memory of the event should return within the next few days. In the meantime, he'll be staying here at the lodge until he's feeling better," Eric added. Gallagher tilted his thin face up into the clear morning sky, then scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I can see the headline now. Local man beaten. Gold mine vandalized." He smiled to himself. "I'm supposed to be on holidays, but a little freelancing is always good for the old pocketbook." "That would be great, Mr. Gallagher," Isaac said. "When would it be in the papers?" The reporter shrugged. "I'll write it up this morning and fax it in for tomorrow's edition." "Perfect," Wes said. "Make sure you mention that Shubel got a look at his attacker." "Where's the old man now?" Gallagher asked. "Upstairs in the lodge," Eric said. "Resting." "Okay," Gallagher said, turning to go. "I'll get started on the piece right away." The reporter had no sooner disappeared up the walk to his cottage when a green half-ton truck turned into the yard and rolled to a noisy stop by the boys. Donna Partridge hopped out waving a piece of paper. "I got the lab report," she cried excitedly. "They tested the perch I sent them from the Baldwin. It was cyanide poisoning that killed them." "Cyanide?" Eric said. "And," Donna continued, "remember the green residue inside the mine building? They tested that and found that it too contained cyanide." "So there's no doubt then," Wes said. "The river was being poisoned from whatever was being dumped into the shaft of the Baldwin Mine." "The cyanide was probably part of some other concentrate," Donna continued. "Hopefully the police labs will uncover exactly what was in those barrels that were dumped into the mine shaft. Cyanide was probably only a small but deadly part of it. Knowing the content of the barrels would give us a better idea of what those men were up to." Her voice trailed off as a blue-panelled van pulled into the yard and came to a stop by the lodge. "What now?" Wes muttered. Two men emerged from the vehicle. They were clutching clipboards and wore the green uniforms of a company called CSC. "We're looking for Mr. Jack Gray," one of the men said. "He's gone into town," Donna said. "Can we help you?" Eric asked. "My parents own this resort." The men grinned sympathetically at Eric. Not for long. "What are you doing here?" Eric asked, taking a step toward the two men. "We're doing a surveying job for Mr. Gray," the one man explained. "Not without my parents' permission, and neither of them are home right now. Jack Gray hasn't bought this resort yet." The two surveyors hesitated. Then one of them looked down at his watch. "What time will they be back?" "My mother won't be home for a couple of hours." One of the men slapped his clipboard against the side of his leg, a scowl darkening his face. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said. "Please let Mr. Gray and your parents know." He turned angrily, yanking open the door of the truck. "Jack Gray sure has his nerve," Donna said, watching the truck head back down the driveway. "You'd think he already owned this place." Isaac was listening to Donna continue her angry tirade when he suddenly became aware of someone behind him. He turned to see Sarah Martin approaching them. "Hello, everyone," Sarah said. "Afternoon, Sarah," Isaac said. "Gallagher was just telling me that Mr. Chase will be recuperating at your lodge for the next few days," Sarah said. "That's right," Eric said. Wes looked down the pathway leading to cabin 6. "Has anyone seen our bear hunter friends lately?" "Not since the night of the big storm," Eric said. "Did you come to any conclusions about what destroyed their bear bait down the Blanche?" Wes asked, turning to Donna. "I wasn't able to say for sure, although we still haven't ruled out wolves." "Maybe those men aren't even bear hunters," Wes said. "That's what I've been saying all along," Isaac agreed. "I think they're using it as some kind of a cover." "Why don't we check out another of their so-called traps?" Wes suggested. "They must have more than one." "But do we know where another one might be?" Donna asked. The boys were thoughtful for a moment. Then Isaac's eyes brightened. He snapped his fingers and turned to Eric. "Remember that map we saw in their cabin the other day? There was a large X on the Waboose River north of here. That could have been another of their bear traps." "What are we waiting for then?" Wes asked. "Let's check it out." "Do you mind as I come along?" Sarah asked. "Sure. The more the merrier," Wes said. "If we use my boat, we can be there in a hop, skip, and a jump." "Let's get going then," Donna said. "We'll find out what kind of hunters these guys really are." "I think I'd better stick around here," Eric said. "I promised my mom I'd finish raking the beach, and someone should be here to keep an eye on old Shubel." "You sure?" Isaac asked. "Yeah, you go ahead." The hot afternoon sun bore down on the travellers as Wes edged his speedboat away from the Calder's dock and set a course for the northern end of the lake. 10 minutes later, they entered the narrow mouth of the Waboose River. "Hunters have set bear bait traps here in the past because of the suckers in this stream," Wes said, easing his way down the twisting waterway. "Bears love fishing for suckers." "Yeah," Isaac agreed, "if there is a bear trap." "What exactly are we looking for?" Sarah asked. "How does one go about baiting a bear?" "Well," Donna began, "a bear bait is essentially an ambush that the hunters set up. They generally leave some meat in an area that will attract the attention of any bears wandering through the area. The meat is usually left hanging a few feet off the ground so that smaller animals can't get at it. Sometimes the hunters will build a platform in the trees where they can lie in wait and set an ambush." "Hardly seems sporting," Sarah said. Isaac continued to scan both banks of the narrow river as they wound their way slowly upstream, searching for anything remotely resembling Wes's recent description of a bear stand. Within 15 minutes, the stream began to narrow noticeably. "You sure the X was marked on this river?" Donna asked, as Wes slowed the boat even further. The powerful outboard motor was now reduced to a low rumble. "Positive," Isaac said emphatically. "And this is the only river at this end of the lake." "Well," Sarah said, "perhaps it's set back from the shoreline." "Or they might have moved the bait," Eric suggested. "Even if they have," Wes said. "We should still be able to see signs of them having been here." He shifted the motor into neutral as further progress was blocked by a huge deadhead. Beyond the fallen tree stretched a barren area about the size of a baseball diamond. "This is as far as we go," Wes said. He and his passengers sat quietly for a moment, surveying the surroundings as their boat bobbed peacefully in the shallow water. "We might as well head back," Isaac said. "There's nothing interesting around here." "Wait a minute," Donna said, pointing to the west bank of the narrow river. "What's that?" A treeless knoll rolled away into a scattering of stunted birch trees. Just visible beyond the top of the knoll was a small patch of white. "Looks like a tent," Isaac said. Wes dropped the motor back into gear and turned the prow toward the west bank. A moment later, Isaac led the others out of the boat and up the small hill. "It is a tent," Sarah whispered as they paused at the brow of the hill. Before them, in the middle of a grove of silver birch, stood a large canvas tent. "It looks deserted," Isaac said as they surveyed the clearing. "Could this be the bear hunters' camp?" Donna asked. "Let's take a look," Eric suggested. "Wait," Wes said, holding up his hand. "Just in case the tent isn't empty and they didn't hear us coming, it might be dangerous for us to come up on them suddenly." He moved toward the canvas shelter. "Hello?" he shouted. The others followed closely behind Wes as he made his way up to the flap which served as the door. With one last "hello," he flipped open the piece of canvas and led the others inside. The interior of the large tent was a disappointment. Only a few scattered pieces of furniture inhabited the flimsy shelter. 2 card tables and several folding chairs took up the middle portion of the tent, and a single canvas cot stood against the far wall. "There's not much here," Sarah observed. "It's not likely they're going to leave anything incriminating behind to make life difficult for them," Wes said. The others gazed around the tent for another minute. "This tent may very well belong to our bear hunter friends," Isaac said, "but there's nothing here to help our cause at all." "Just a minute." Donna walked over to the cot. A piece of paper was protruding from under one of its legs. "What is it?" Wes asked. Donna flattened out the sheet of paper and squinted down at the faint script. Isaac and Wes crowded in beside her. Isaac could see that the bottom 2/3 of the sheet had been ripped off and was missing. "Look at this," Donna said, pointing to several words at the top of the paper. "Ministry of the Environment," Wes read. "And look here," Donna said, sliding her finger to the bottom corner of the torn paper. "Duncan Township," Isaac read. "And then there's some numbers, 1187004. The rest is torn off." They stared blankly at the piece of paper for a moment. "It's got to be a mining claim certificate," Wes said. "My grandfather used to stake claims, and this is what the forms look like." "Do you mean that they're actually out here staking claims?" Isaac said in disbelief. "They can't be staking them now," Wes corrected. "Duncan Township is in the area that's now off limits to staking. Look at the date. It was last year." "Maybe they're the ones doing the exploration work over by Wildwood Lake," Donna suggested. "Isn't that in Duncan Township?" Wes nodded in agreement. "This tent could be their headquarters when they're out in the field," Isaac said. "Let's get going," Wes said, wiping his brow. "It's hot and smelly in here." Isaac followed Wes and the others out into the sunshine. The coolness of the morning wafted over him, and for a moment he stood relishing the breeze off the river. "Well," Wes said, "we'd better scram." He reached up and broke a large branch from a nearby jack pine. As the others started back for the boat, Wes trailed behind, using the pine branch to obliterate their tracks. "Can't be too careful," he said. "What could those men be up to?" Donna asked. "All we know for sure is that their interests seem to lie more in the area of mineral exploration than bear hunting," Wes said. "We can't even be sure that they're doing anything illegal." He started up the motor and eased the boat out into the narrow channel. "Shouldn't we report what we found to the authorities?" Sarah asked. Donna's brow wrinkled in thought. "I already mentioned the trench we found back at Wildwood Lake to the police. Who knows when they'll get around to checking into it?" Isaac gazed at the shoreline, deep in thought as Wes guided his boat expertly back down the waterway and then out onto Lake Kenogami. No sooner had they started across the lake when Isaac suddenly straightened and pointed out across the water. Another boat was approaching them at high speed. "That looks like Eric's boat," he said. "Appears to be in quite a hurry too," Wes agreed. "I hope everything's okay with Shubel. Maybe we should have taken him with us." With his throttle wide open, it took Eric less than a minute to reach them, and as he neared, Wes killed his motor, allowing the two boats to quickly drift into each other. As Eric's boat approached, they could see Shubel sitting in the prow. "What's wrong?" Isaac shouted. Eric waited until his boat bumped right into his friends before speaking. "I'm glad we found you," he said. "Someone just tried to kidnap Shubel." Chapter 13. From Bad to Worse. Wes guided his speedboat into the beach in front of the Calder's lodge, cut the motor, then followed Isaac and the others ashore. A few minutes later, they were all sitting around the kitchen table with large glasses of iced tea. Shubel sat at the far end of the table, a mysterious grin on his face. Isaac turned to his cousin. "So tell us what happened with Shubel while we were gone." Eric looked over at the old man and grinned. "Not long after you left, Shubel went for a walk down on the beach when a power boat pulled up close to shore. 3 men jumped out of the boat and came charging ashore toward him. Well, they were in for quite a surprise. Instead of running away, Shubel turned on his attackers, and before you knew it, all 3 of them were scrambling back to the boat and heading for the hills." Eric smiled admiringly at the old man. Shubel looked sheepishly around the table. "If I hadn't been carrying a walking stick the size of a baseball bat, I might have been in big trouble." "Did you recognize them?" Isaac asked. The old man shook his head. "Thank goodness you're all right," Sarah said while the others nodded in agreement. Donna Partridge glanced down at her watch. "Well, I'd better get going," she said. "I've got a lot of work to do." Sarah nodded in agreement. "My grandma will be wondering where I am." Donna and Sarah had barely left the lodge when the sound of an approaching outboard motor drifted in through the open window. Isaac looked around the table. Who could that be? They rose to their feet and went to the door. A small motorboat was just pulling alongside the dock. The lone passenger deftly looped a mooring line around one of the poles and climbed carefully out onto the pier. "Jesse," Wes said, a wide smile crossing his face. Shubel and the 3 boys made their way down to the lake as the older woman ambled up the shoreline toward them. "How you feeling, old man?" she asked. Shubel gave a feeble little wave. "Okay, although I'm embarrassed to admit how much all this excitement has tired me out. I was just thinking that it might be nice to lie down for an hour or 2. With a tired smile, he turned and headed back for the lodge. "Where's your mother, Eric?" Jesse asked, looking around the lodge. "It's getting late." "She went into town to see my dad and get some supplies, but she ought to be home soon." Jesse led them back up to the lodge and into the kitchen. "You boys sit down." The older woman then bustled over to the cupboards checking for food. "I'll bet you boys haven't even eaten anything since breakfast. Where's that moose meat I brought over for your mother the other day? Is it still here?" Isaac could feel the day's tension flowing from his body as the smell of frying moose meat soon permeated the small room. A few minutes later, Jesse returned to the table with a large platter of moose meat steaks. "Wes," she said, "you say grace." Wes bowed his head and offered another sincere prayer of thanks for their food. As the blessing ended, Isaac glanced around the table at the others. "I've never eaten moose meat before," he admitted. "You'll love it," Wes said, and Jessie prepares it better than anyone." He nodded approvingly at Jessie as he took another bite. "Been ages since I've tasted moose meat this good." "Since last Thursday," Jessie corrected. The others laughed. "We'd better check on old Shubel," Eric suggested. "Make sure he's all right." "You'd better give him a few minutes to get to sleep," Jessie said. "He needs his rest right now more than anything." "He ought to be safe here," Wes said. Eric grunted. "I sure hope so," he said in a low voice. "Things sure haven't been going very well lately." His eyes met Isaac's. "Shubel gets beat up. Someone poisons the river. My mother is selling the resort." Wes cleared his throat. "Let's just take things one day at a time. We've all seen God work in some pretty mysterious ways before, and things turned out okay. That's something my old grandpappy drilled into me." Eric looked across the table at his friend and scowled. Maybe God is just a little too busy to notice the problems of a few people in the middle of nowhere. Wes laughed. "Did you know that according to the Bible, God knows the exact number of hairs on your head? Now I'm quite sure that if he's aware of how many hairs are on Eric Calder's head, he certainly knows everything else about him." A twinkle lit up Wes's dark brown eyes. Eric stared sullenly at his plate, but did not answer. "Tell him about how we get to be God's children," Jessie said, passing a plate of tea biscuits down the table. "When Wes's grandfather talked to me about Jesus, I liked that part the best." Wes nodded. "That's my favorite part too. You see, even though God loves all of the people in the world, we can only become his children when we admit to him that we're lost sinners and ask him to save us. And best of all, he's provided a fail-safe way for us to get back into his good graces through his Son, Jesus Christ, who died as our substitute. We need to place our faith in him and realize that we can never please God through our own good deeds." "Your grandfather explained all that to us," Eric said, "but a lot of good it did him. God still let him get killed." "Oh," Jessie said, "but it did do him good. Where would he be now without Jesus?" Eric looked up at Jessie thoughtfully, then returned to his moose steak. "I think Eric feels that Jesus is fine for getting people to heaven, but he isn't much use for the here and now," Wes said. Isaac glanced uneasily at the flight of stairs at the far end of the room. "I don't mean to change the subject, but there's no other way of getting to Shubel's room than by going up those stairs, is there?" he asked, turning to his cousin. "Well, there is a back stairway, but the door is always locked from the inside." "We'd better make sure Shubel is all right," Wes said, rising from the table. Isaac felt his heart begin to race as he rose to his feet and followed his friend up the stairs. Wes rapped lightly on the bedroom door. "Nothing. He's probably sleeping," Isaac whispered. Wes hesitated for a moment, then turned the knob and pushed open the door. Immediately, Isaac knew that something was dreadfully wrong. The small bedroom was empty. "He's gone," Wes said, glancing around the room, then looking back at his friends. "Somehow they got in here and grabbed the old man." Chapter 14. Lives in Disarray. The three boys and Jessie looked around the empty bedroom in disbelief. "Doesn't look like anything has even been disturbed," Isaac finally said. "What do we do?" Eric asked. Wes led the way to the far end of the hallway and then down the flight of steps. He tried the door at the bottom of the stairs. "It's not locked," he said, pushing it open. "We always keep it locked," Eric said. "They must have sprung the lock," Isaac said. "They may have been waiting for Shubel when he came up to his room. He probably didn't even know what hit him." Jessie led the way out the door and into the backyard, and then eased herself onto one knee. Very slowly she ran the flat of her hand over the ground, then began inching her way across the yard toward the lake, tracing the signs. "They came from the lake," she said. "2 men." "Let's go," Eric said, taking a couple of steps in the direction Jessie had indicated. "We've got to catch up to them." Just hold on, Wes said. We're not even sure which way they've gone. Let's think this out. He led Isaac and the others around to the front of the lodge. They were just rounding the corner when a car pulled into the yard. Looks like my mom's back, Eric said. Aunt Helga emerged from the car, looking anxiously as the small group of people approached her. Someone's kidnapped Mr. Chase, Eric said. His mother stared at him in disbelief. Kidnapped Shubel? How did that happen? It just happened, Isaac said. They snuck up the back steps and grabbed him out of his room. We were downstairs and didn't hear a thing. Who would do that? She looked instinctively out over the surface of the darkening lake before them. The bear hunters, Isaac said suddenly. Have you seen anything of the bear hunters lately? It must have been them. They've been pretty quiet the last couple of days, Aunt Helga said doubtfully. Maybe they're out checking their baits, sleeping in the bush. Isaac looked back out over the lake. We've got to do something about Shubel, he said. There's only one reason why they would risk coming in here and grabbing him like that. They were probably worried that he would be able to identify one of them. Let's call the police, Eric said. Aunt Helga sprang into action. I'll do that, she called over her shoulder as she headed up the steps into the lodge. Eric and Isaac looked helplessly at each other. We can't waste any more time, Isaac said. No telling what's happening to Shubel. They are going to kill him, aren't they? Eric said. Why else would they take him? They're afraid he's going to unravel their whole operation. There's a lot of places in this country to make a person disappear permanently, Wes said. A moment later, Aunt Helga returned from the lodge. I got through to the police, she said. They said it'll be about half an hour before they can get an officer out here. A half hour? Wes echoed. We can't wait a half hour. We've got to go after Shubel now, Isaac said. Every minute counts. You mean we should go after him ourselves? Eric asked. We've got to. But where could they have taken him? Well, we can't just go charging blindly out of here unless we have an idea where they might have taken Shubel, Wes said. Let's stop and think for a minute, Eric said. If it is the bear hunters, where might they be going? I think they'll head to the remotest place possible, Wes said. But where? Isaac asked. There's over 1 million remote places around here. In fact, just about everything's remote. Suddenly, Eric's eyes widened. The campsite we found on the Waboose River, he said excitedly. If that was the bear hunters' camp, maybe that's where they went. Yeah, Isaac agreed. That's right. The Waboose River is just about as remote as you can get. It's worth a try, Wes said. Let's get going. Jessie struggled to her feet from where she had been sitting on the steps. You stay here with Helga, Jessie, Wes said. No, the old woman said emphatically. I'm coming. Wes shrugged. You sure you're up to it? Aunt Helga put her hand on Eric's arm. I don't like this, boys. Promise me you'll be careful. It's getting dark. If you do find out where Shubel is, come back right away and notify the police. Don't worry, Aunt Helga, Isaac said. Wes has that spotlight on the front of the boat that lights up everything for 100 yards. Besides, he and Eric know Kenogami really well. Jessie led them down to the lake, knelt by her boat, and lifted out a long, double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. Breaking the chamber open, she reached into the pocket of her baggy skirt and withdrew a couple shells. Now, she said, dropping the shells into the chambers and snapping it shut. I'm ready. We'll take Wes's boat. It's fast. Let's go. A light rain was beginning to fall as Wes's souped-up 75-horsepower outboard roared out onto the lake. Mounted on the boat's prow, a spotlight lit up the dark waters of Lake Kenogami for more than 100 feet. Better watch for rocks, Jessie suggested. They're bad at the far end of the lake. Don't worry, Wes shouted above the motor. I know Lake Kenogami like the back of my hand. A few minutes later, he eased the boat into the narrow mouth of the Waboose River, then cautiously negotiated each bend of the meandering waterway. They hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when Wes abruptly turned off the motor and spotlight. "Grab a paddle," he ordered. "We don't want to advertise our arrival." Isaac found a couple of canoe paddles lying on the bottom of the boat and handed one to Eric. "Can't see much," Eric whispered as they paddled the cumbersome boat upriver. "The trees along the riverbanks are too tall." "How far is it to the campsite?" Isaac asked. "Not much farther," Wes replied. "We'd better pull into shore over there." He pointed to a small clearing ahead of them. Eric and Isaac directed the boat into the narrow stretch of beach, then silently stepped ashore. Together, the three boys skidded the boat in among the trees, then helped Jesse out onto dry land. The double-barreled shotgun was still gripped tightly in the old woman's hand. "Shh," Wes warned. "Don't you have a flashlight?" Isaac asked. "No lights," Wes replied. "Too easy to be seen." With that, he led the small group away from the river and into the dense wilderness. Immediately, they were plunged into total darkness, the forest seeming to reach out and swallow them. With each step, Isaac had to probe the ground at his feet so as not to trip over a stump or tree root. After trudging through the damp underbrush for 5 minutes, a faint light appeared through the trees ahead of them. As Wes drew the group to a halt under a huge tamarack tree, a great yellow moon broke from behind a cloud and lit up their surroundings. Immediately before them was the large white tent, and emanating from within its thin walls was a pale yellowish glow. Even as they inched closer through the curtain of trees, they could hear the low murmur of voices drifting toward them on the night air. Wes pointed down to the waterfront. In the glow of moonlight, Isaac could see a motorboat pulled up on the shore. "Can you fix that motor so it won't start?" Wes whispered. "Quickly and quietly?" Isaac nodded. "Just tear off the spark plug wire. That ought to do it." "Go ahead," Wes whispered. "Meet us up by that grove of birch trees." He pointed to a clump of trees between the river and the tent. Isaac slipped carefully down to the shoreline, dimly aware of the voices coming from the tent. Perhaps he might be able to distinguish Shubel's voice among the others. But the sounds were muted and unintelligible. When he reached the boat, he slipped out of his running shoes, stepped into the shallow water, and waded around to the back of the outboard motor. The moon lit the area quite well, revealing the outline of a 60-horsepower engine. Isaac slipped his hand around back of the motor and grasped the rubber hose connecting the motor to a spark plug. With a quick tug, he wrenched the wire free from the motor, then tossed it into a nearby bush. Silently, he waded back to shore, pulled his shoes back on, then made his way up to the clump of birch trees. His friends were waiting for him. Wes now had Jesse's double-barreled shotgun cradled in his left arm. With a quick nod, he stepped out from the trees. Isaac grasped his friend by the arm. "What's the plan?" he whispered. "Follow my lead and stay close." Wes handed Eric his hunting knife. "Go around back. When the time's right, slice open the rear of the tent with this knife and make an appearance, but don't be a hero. If you hear things going badly, head back to the boat and go for help." Crouching as low as possible, Eric vanished into the darkness. Wes gave his friend a few seconds, then led the others directly toward the flap at the front of the big tent, the voices inside growing louder with each step. Isaac strained his ears for any sound of Shubel's voice. "Perhaps he's not here," Isaac thought. "Maybe we're too late. Or this might not even be the right place. The tent could be filled with a bunch of fishermen from the city." Wes paused by the front of the tent and glanced back at Jesse and Isaac. Isaac moved silently up beside him, the peak standing a foot above his head and the sides extending about 15 feet on either side of the peak. Wes drew in a deep breath, reached down and pulled the flaps open and disappeared into the tent. Chapter 15. Night Pursuit. Isaac threw the canvas flap to one side and followed Wes into the giant tent, his eyes quickly adjusting to the bright kerosene lantern. 3 men, leaning over a card table, gaped in astonishment at the sudden intruders. "Everybody stay where you are," Wes ordered, leveling the shotgun at the nearest man. He stepped into the tent so that Isaac and Jesse had room to enter. The tallest of the men straightened, blinking rapidly. "What's this?" he asked belligerently. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. The voice. It was the same menacing tone he had heard the night when they had fixed the roof at the bear hunter's cabin. And the eyes, the dark, piercing eyes, were the same ones that had looked right through him during that ugly night. Isaac pulled his gaze reluctantly from the bear hunter and swept the room. Shubel. The old hermit lay on a cot in the far corner of the tent, bound and gagged. "Untie Shubel," Wes said to Jesse, "and Isaac, get the rifle." A Winchester 30-30 was leaning against the table, precariously close to the bear hunter that Isaac had recognized. Isaac snatched up the rifle, then levered a shell into the chamber. Jesse leaned over Shubel, slicing through the cord tying his ankles with a large jackknife. "Get up, old man." Shubel struggled to his feet, then stood for a minute, tottering slightly. "I'll be okay as soon as I get the feeling back in my hands and feet," he mumbled, rubbing his wrists. He moved gingerly across the canvas floor to the tent door, one wrinkled hand on Jesse's elbow. Wes waved the shotgun at the 3 men. "Move back from the table," he ordered. The bear hunters edged cautiously to the rear of the tent as Wes approached with his double-barreled weapon. Wes, still eyeing his captives, picked up several scattered sheets of paper laying on the table. He handed one to Shubel. "What do you make of this?" he asked. Shubel fumbled in his breast pocket for his reading glasses, then, holding the paper at arm's length, studied it for several seconds. "This appears to be a geological report of some kind," he said, waving the paper in the direction of the 3 bear hunters. "Looks like our friends have some illicit interests in these here parts." He took a step closer to the man with the dark eyes. "I suppose you was the boys that dumped the poison into the old Baldwin." He pushed his face to within an inch of the other man. "And I suppose you was the fella that wonked me on the head the other night." The bear hunter retreated a step or 2. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, straightening his shoulders. "And I'll bet you're partnered with that snake oil salesman Jack Gray," Wes said. "He's probably the brains behind this operation." A sudden feeling of uneasiness washed over Isaac. Eric. Instinctively he glanced around the room, looking for his cousin. Eric had not yet put in his appearance. Where was he? He looked to the back of the tent where he had expected the other boy to make his dramatic entrance, but there was no ripping of canvas, no sudden appearance. He looked over at Wes. It was then that he felt, rather than heard, a slight stir behind them. He turned slowly, expecting to see Eric poke his head into the tent. What he saw in the entranceway made his heart leap into his mouth. Gallagher stood in the opening, a large silver revolver gripped tightly in his hand and a smile creasing his face. Isaac gaped at the reporter in astonishment. "Gallagher?" Gallagher nodded politely. "Drop that gun, boy," he ordered, pointing his revolver at Isaac's midsection. Isaac and Wes eased their weapons to the floor of the tent as the dark-eyed bear hunter stepped up to the 2 boys. He gave Isaac a shove and scooped up the 2 guns. "Good work," he said to Gallagher, pointing the barrel of the shotgun at Wes. "We got a little careless. Never figured that anyone would know about this little spot." Gallagher moved around to where his partners were standing. "I saw them leave the resort. Kinda figured they'd be coming here. I noticed their boat pulled up on the shore downstream," he explained. "I figured I'd better paddle the rest of the way on the QT." Shubel, his arms raised above his head, shuffled a little closer to the dark-eyed bear hunter. "You got us, boys," he said. Now would you do me a small favor? Fill us in on exactly what is going on. I'd hate to go to my grave not knowing why you folks found me to be so objectionable." A smile broke across the face of the dark-eyed man. "You've got a point there, old man," he said, "because right now there's no one left to save your wrinkled old hide." He paused for a second, the smile leaving his face. "But first of all, you better tell us something. That bear bait we set up to make people think we were honest-to-goodness men of the woods, did you sabotage our little trap?" Shubel set his mouth in a thin, stubborn line. "I did. I won't tolerate any more traps around Kenogami. I've made it my own personal responsibility. I even sprung a couple of Jesse's traps down this way." Jesse looked at the old man in astonishment. "You did?" Shubel Chase nodded his head. "I did for a fact, Jesse, and I make no apologies. I told you a dozen times that there just ain't enough wildlife left in these parts. I know because I've been keeping track these past few years." The hard-eyed man laughed dryly. "Well, that explains that. Not that it really matters. We just set that trap as part of our cover." "We knew you weren't bear hunters," Isaac said. "Yes, but did you know what we really were?" Gallagher asked. "We had our suspicions," Wes said, "especially when we found your trench over by Wildwood Lake." "Well, it looks like you were on the right track. Not that it'll do you any good now," the dark-eyed man said. "Now we just have to figure out what to do with you." Gallagher stepped over to the table and picked up a handful of the sheets of paper. "To put it quite simply, we're gold hunters, and we've been crisscrossing the Kenogami area for the past 3 years. Each year, we've been getting closer and closer to what we believe to be the biggest gold discovery ever seen in these parts. But then, our wonderful government decided to throw all of our careful plans out the window by shutting this area down to exploration and development. Our last glimmer of hope now remains in making our discoveries public before the government finalizes their plans of making this area into a park. A new gold mine would mean a lot of new jobs for the North. We have a batch of ore samples being analyzed even as we speak, and if they're as rich as we think they are, it might be enough to get the government to leave the area open for the development of a gold mine. Any complications whatsoever, though? Complications like you people, and the government will never consider changing their plans. We now have everything in place to get them to at least postpone the new legislation." "Won't that get you into trouble?" Isaac asked. "I mean, they'll know you've been doing exploration work in a restricted area." Gallagher smiled and turned to a short, stout man standing behind him. "That's where Shorty comes in," he said. "The 3 of us fade into the woodwork, and Shorty will be well compensated for taking the fall." "What about the poison in the Baldwin Mine?" Shubel asked. Gallagher laughed. "The result of some last-minute haste, I'm afraid. We were trying to get our exploration work done before the rezoning legislation was passed, and we needed somewhere to stash the waste from the small milling operation we had set up. Anyway, we figured that old mine shaft was a safe bet for storing waste, as it was just sitting out in the middle of nowhere." Wes looked back at Gallagher. "So, you're really not a reporter then?" Gallagher's smile broadened. "Actually, I am what you might call a freelancer, but a different sort than those working for a newspaper." He waved the pistol. "Get over there." He herded his captives to the other side of the table with its collection of charts and a hissing kerosene lantern. The dark-eyed man turned to Gallagher. "What do we do with them?" The smile disappeared from Gallagher's face. "At the very least, they've got to disappear from sight for a few days, until our plans are settled. Then it will be our word against theirs. And if they decide not to cooperate, well, maybe that big trench we dug over by Wildwood Lake will serve a dual purpose." He paused while the imaginations of his partners sketched in the details. No one would ever find them there. Wes peered suspiciously at the 4 men. Did you start the forest fire over there? Not one of our better ideas, Gallagher said, nodding toward Shorty. Shorty lit the fire on the spur of the moment when he saw you snooping around the trench. Seemed like a good idea at the time, didn't it? But the fire almost brought the whole of the civilized world down on top of us. He grimaced at the memory. Anyway, fortunately for us, everything turned out all right. Isaac noticed a slight movement at the door of the tent behind the four men, and his eyes grew large. The dark form of his cousin slipped silently into the entrance behind the men, a stick gripped in his left hand. "Stay perfectly still," Eric ordered, poking Gallagher in the back with his stick, "or I'll shoot you where you stand." For an instant Gallagher and the other men froze. It was all the edge that Wes needed. He stepped quickly toward Gallagher, yanked the silver pistol from his hand and turned it on the others. "Drop those guns," he ordered. The two men holding the shotgun and rifle hesitated for only a second, then let their weapons fall to the canvas floor. Isaac scooped up the two guns, handing one to Shubel. Eric stepped forward, skirting Gallagher and the others, then turned. He pointed a long stick at Gallagher and pretended to cock the hammer of a rifle, a broad smile on his face. "You'll pay for that," the dark-eyed man said with a slight tremor in his voice. "I'll get you if it's the last thing I do." Eric nodded. "By the time you get out of jail, I'll be dead of old age." The dark-eyed man took a step toward Isaac. "How much guts do you have anyway, kid?" he asked in a low voice. He took another step. "Do you have enough guts to pull that trigger?" Isaac retreated a step, his back now against the tent wall, the rifle straightening in his hands. Shubel Chase's wiry form appeared out of nowhere, stepping between Isaac and the other man. The broad end of the 12-gauge shotgun was pointed squarely at the chest of the other man. "Step back, sonny," he said in a low voice. "This boy may not want to pull a trigger on the likes of you, but I surely will." The dark-eyed man hesitated for an instant, then suddenly took a quick step backward. As he did, his right hand swept across the table, knocking the kerosene lantern to the floor with a crash. For one brief, terrifying instant, the tent was pitched in utter darkness. Then a ragged ball of flames exploded from the canvas floor. One of the bear hunters shouted in terror and stumbled past Isaac toward the doorway. Isaac stood for an instant, watching in horror as the tent wall before him dissolved in a sheet of flames. He spun on his heels and lunged for the exit. As he and the others spilled out into the night, the raging inferno completely engulfed the flimsy structure. Isaac searched the blackness around him, his eyes gradually adjusting to the sudden darkness. Everyone seemed to have escaped the tent and were now standing in shocked silence, watching their shelter dissolve in a roar of flames. Jesse and Shubel stood slightly apart from the others, breathing in long, ragged gasps. The bear hunter they called Shorty was down on his hands and knees, gasping for air. Isaac glanced down at his hand, thankful that he still had the rifle. Suddenly, from out of the corner of his eye, he saw a dark blur barreling out of the night straight toward him. The collision knocked him off his feet, the breath exploding from his lungs in one agonizing gush. Crashing to the ground, he could feel the gun slip helplessly from his grip. He lay there gasping, all breath driven from his body. For one awful moment he felt sure that he would die right where he was lying, unable to take another breath. "Come on, boy." A strong hand was on his arm, hauling him to his feet. It was Shubel. Isaac staggered several steps, dragged from the clearing and into the trees. "They got one of the guns," Shubel shouted. "We have to get to the boat and scram." As he stumbled down the pitch-dark trail after the old hermit, Isaac could see Jesse and Wes just ahead of them. "I don't think they're following us," Eric said. Shubel grunted. "Probably because they know we still have this." He held up the shotgun. "But they'll be coming." "Wait," Isaac said. "I wrecked their outboard motor." "They've got Gallagher's boat," Eric said. Isaac groaned. "You're right." He followed Shubel into the trees, his chest still aching. "We've got to make it to the boat," Eric was saying. "Wes's outboard is the fastest on the lake. They'll never catch us." The 5 of them crashed through the tangled underbrush until finally arriving at the shallow cove where Wes had stashed his boat. "Hurry!" Wes shouted, pushing the boat out into the current. The big motor roared to life as Isaac and Eric climbed aboard with Shubel and Jesse. Wes gunned the 75-horsepower engine, and the boat leapt forward. In an instant, they were careening down the narrow river, the bright spotlight guiding them around each hairpin turn. "Yahoo!" Eric yelled above the roar of the motor as they burst from the mouth of the river and sped across the dark surface of Lake Kenogami. Isaac could feel an overwhelming sense of relief as he looked out over the broad expanse of the familiar lake. "Watch out for the rocks, Wes!" Jesse yelled. Wes was already weaving in and out of the outcroppings of rock that dotted that section of the lake. "Don't worry," Wes shouted. "We've got to get back to the resort and call the police. Gallagher will be right on our tail." He had no sooner gotten the words out when a light suddenly emerged from the mouth of the river behind them. Even over the din of Wes's motor, they could hear the roar of the other boat. And what frightened Isaac most was that it sounded even more powerful than Wes's motor. "They're catching up," Eric said in disbelief. "What kind of a motor does Gallagher have anyway?" Isaac could feel his stomach constricting as he watched the other boat rapidly gaining on them, its bright spotlight now inching menacingly toward them. Wes jerked the boat's steering wheel to escape the spotlight, and as he did, they heard a sharp crack even above the sound of the 2 motors. "They're shooting at us!" Eric yelled. Everyone but Wes ducked below the gunnels. Several more cracks sounded over the water. Shubel threw the barrel of the shotgun up to his shoulder and was about to return fire when there was a resounding crash directly behind them. Isaac lifted his head back above the gunnels, staring in disbelief at the dark waters behind them. They were gone. The light had disappeared, and the sound of the pursuing motor had vanished into the night. "What happened?" Wes yelled back over his shoulder. "It's a trick!" Eric shouted. "They're trying to sneak up on us in the dark." "No, they're not," Jesse said. "They hit the rocks." Chapter 16. On the Rocks. Wes wheeled the boat in a tight circle, then cut the speed so that the wash rolled the boat forward on a foot-high crest. The boat's powerful spotlight lit the lake ahead of them for almost 100 feet. "You sure they hit a rock and it's not some sort of a trick?" Isaac asked, rising from his seat. "Look!" Eric shouted, pointing to a spot just out of the spotlight's range. "It's them!" Isaac's mouth dropped open at the unexpected sight. The boat had struck a craggy protrusion of rocks and was prow up and sinking fast. The powerful outboard motor had been knocked from its mounts and had already disappeared beneath the lake's surface. Clinging desperately to the crushed hulk was one of the survivors. In the nearby water, 2 more heads bobbed in the darkness. Jesse eyed the floundering men suspiciously. "Be careful, they're full of tricks." Shubel poked his shotgun over the edge of the boat as they drew alongside one of the men. It was Shorty, and he was floundering desperately in the deep water. "No trouble from you, son," Shubel said, displaying his weapon. "One bit of fuss and we leave you right here." He kept the gun trained on Shorty while Isaac and Eric pulled him into the craft and heaved him into the prow. Shorty sat there, gasping, the water dripping from his sodden clothing. "There's another one," Shubel said, pointing to a dark figure bobbing nearby. As Eric swung the powerful spotlight toward the man in the water, Isaac could feel his breath catch. "Hurry!" he shouted. "This one's face down." Together with Eric, he leaned over the boat's gunnels and hoisted the unconscious man aboard. It was Gallagher. They flopped him down by Shorty and heard him give a sharp gasp, then sputter feebly. "Looks like he won't need mouth to mouth," Isaac said. Shorty put an ear to his partner's face. "He's breathing." "Lay him on his side, then," Wes ordered. Shorty did as he was told, then sat back, eyeing Shubel's wavering shotgun. "You watch that gun doesn't go off, old man." Wes manoeuvred the boat next to Gallagher's stricken vessel. A third man was still clinging to the remnants of the overturned boat. "Better hurry," Jessie said. "She's going down fast." By stretching as far as possible, Isaac was able to catch hold of the man's outstretched hand. "Heave ho," Isaac said with a loud grunt as he and Eric pulled the man aboard. A large cut was noticeable on his forehead. "There must be one more," Wes said, turning the boat in a tight circle while Eric panned the spotlight across the water. "Does anybody see him?" Isaac scanned the water, almost dreading the sight of the man with the dark, evil eyes. "Can't see him," Eric said. "Was the other man in the boat with you?" Wes asked Shorty. "He was sitting up by the front," Shorty acknowledged. "He must be around here somewhere." Wes turned the boat in another circle, passing close to the rapidly sinking boat. "He was here a minute ago," Shorty said. "I saw him after the crash and he seemed all right." "Watch it, fellas," Shubel said. "He may be playing possum on us." For 10 more minutes they scoured the waters around the treacherous rocks. "He couldn't have made it to shore, could he?" Isaac asked. "It's not all that far." Eric swung the spotlight toward the distant shoreline. "I think we would have noticed him," Wes said, "but I guess it's possible." "He's gone," Jessie said simply, "one way or the other." With Jessie's words, Wes eased the throttle of the boat down and moved out across the lake toward the far shore. The lights of the Calder's resort glimmered like stars in the distance. When Wes pulled the boat into the dock at the resort, the lights in the main lodge told them that Aunt Helga was still up. Before they had even secured the boat, she was beside them, a thick housecoat wrapped around her. "I heard your motor," she said, looking nervously down at the extra passengers and the shotgun gripped tightly in Shubel Chase's hands. "What's going on, Eric?" "It's okay, Mum." Eric put a hand on her shoulder. "Everything's under control now." Aunt Helga's eyes widened. "You found Shubel. Thank goodness." She turned back up the trail to the lodge as Wes, Eric and Isaac helped the others ashore. Shubel Chase took up the rear of the small procession, his shotgun still trained on the 3 injured men. "Can't take any chances," he warned. "These fellas are still liable to be playing possum." The police finally arrived a half-hour later. It was Shubel who did most of the explaining when it came to filling them in on the events of the last few days. "And you say one of the men probably drowned in the lake when their boat hit the rocks?" the policeman asked. "Appears so," Shubel said. "Either that or he somehow made it to shore," Wes added. "Not likely," the policeman said. "He probably banged his head and went to the bottom without even knowing what hit him. Shorty claims to have seen him after the accident and he appeared to be okay," Eric said. Isaac found himself wishing that the policeman was right, but something told him that the man with the dark, evil eyes was harder to kill than that. A shudder passed through him as he looked out the lodge window into the dark of the night. "We'll send our divers out to the spot in the morning," the policeman assured them. "If he drowned, we'll find him. If not, we'll still find him." He grinned slightly. "We always get our man." Aunt Helga rejoined the little group with a large pot of coffee. "I thought that everyone could use something hot to drink." There was a murmur of appreciation as she led them over to the long table in the middle of the dining room. "Wes, Jessie and Shubel, you're all staying here tonight. We have lots of room, and that's that." Her guests smiled gratefully, exhaustion clearly marked on the faces of the 2 older people. "And just to warn you," Aunt Helga added, "I've been doing some thinking about this resort and our future plans. I'll fill you in on my ideas in the morning." Isaac and the others looked up at her curiously. But not until then, she said. Epilogue. Decisions. Eric and Isaac dropped wearily into their chairs at the dining room table, exhausted from a morning spent cutting grass under the hot July sun. Isaac glanced around him and managed a smile. The table was crowded with diners. "I'm so glad you could all be here," Aunt Helga said, smiling at Wes and Jessie. "Today is something of a celebration. As soon as we're finished with lunch, I'm going into town. My husband is due to be released from the hospital this afternoon." "All right," Eric exclaimed. "I'll go with you, Mom." Shubel Chase cleared his throat. "Look, I'm sure grateful for your hospitality, ma'am, but I've got to get back to my shack. My old dog's probably given up on me by now." "Now you sit right there, Mr. Chase," Aunt Helga said. "We all owe you a great debt, and I want you to hear this as well. I have an important announcement." Aunt Helga's words were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Without waiting for a reply, Donna Partridge and Jack Gray entered the room, both smiling broadly. "You're just in time for lunch," Aunt Helga said. "Come on in and have a seat." Jack Gray pulled out a chair beside Wes. "I got your message, Mrs. Calder. Glad to hear you finally made a decision about selling the resort." "I certainly have, Mr. Gray." She waited until the big man and Donna were seated on either side of Wes. Jack Gray turned to Wes. "I hear you boys had quite an adventure last night," he said. "That's for sure," Wes agreed. "And that newspaper fellow Gallagher," Jack Gray continued. "I sure read him the wrong way," he chuckled to himself. "And those so-called bear hunters, they were actually working on developing a mine in this area." Aunt Helga smiled patiently at Jack Gray. "Okay, everyone, listen up for a minute. I have a couple of important announcements." She paused expectantly as all eyes turned her way. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gray, but my husband and I have decided to give this place one more go." Isaac sagged back in his chair. "I thought you were selling the resort to Mr. Gray." "Not anymore." "What?" Jack Gray rose to his feet. "We had a deal," he said, his voice strained. He waved his hand disgustedly at those gathered around the table and stormed out of the lodge. Wes laughed. "This is great news." Shubel got to his feet. "Well, I'm mighty pleased you won't be selling out, Mrs. Calder," he said, tipping his cap to her. "And I hope the rest of Jack Gray's plans fall through too. We don't need any casinos on this lake, thank you very much." "Wait," Eric said. "Do you think it's safe to go back to your cabin? We don't know yet what happened to that last guy. The police divers haven't found anything yet." "And they likely won't either," Shubel agreed. "I think that hard-eyed man just skedaddled. He's got no reason to stay around here now that his plans have fallen through." "I don't know," Isaac said reluctantly. "He made some pretty serious threats about making sure he got even with us, remember? If it was the last thing he ever does." "Well," Shubel said, turning to go, "the main thing is that no one is going to be dumping poison in the river, and no more fish will be dying." He looked across the table to Jessie. "And no one will be setting animal traps around Kenagami either, will they?" Wes laughed and got to his feet. "Don't worry, Shubel, I'll keep Jessie in line. And speaking of that, we'd better get going too. It's been a pretty exciting week." Shubel nodded to those around the table, then slowly shuffled from the room. "And Wes," Aunt Helga said, walking Jessie and Wes to the door. "Don't you be taking these boys away from their work for the next few days. They've got a lot of catching up to do." "I'll come by tomorrow and give these poor lads a hand." He gave the group a big wink, then followed Jessie out into the yard. Isaac drew in a lungful of warm summer air as he followed Eric out into the sunshine. "The Lord seems to have had his eye on us all through these difficulties," he said, glancing at his cousin. "It would seem so," Eric said with a grin. "And what's even more, God even looks after some of us who aren't quite ready for his help." Isaac paused by the great spreading willow tree and looked out over the calm waters of Lake Kenogami. "I think those are the kind of people he enjoys helping most," he said. Eric slapped his cousin on the back, grinning broadly. "And in that regard, he has something in common with you and me." "What's that?" "It would appear that he's not finished working yet." Isaac laughed. "Well, let's get going then. Unlike him, we've got a lot of catching up to do." Alone. There was a slight rustle from the branches of a leafy sumac bush. A small dark bird with red-tipped wings flitted from its shelter and flew rapidly to the abandoned building, disappearing through a small hole near the roof. Far above the forest floor in the branches of the jack pine, the old owl turned its gaze to a slight movement immediately beneath its perch. The owl's huge eyes seemed to bore deep into the thin covering of underbrush 20 feet below, for darkness had yet to make inroads in the soft summer evening. It had been several days now since men had prowled about its little domain, and the owl was visibly more relaxed. That evening it had gone back to its old habit of moving stealthily back and forth on its favourite branch as it waited for the mice to begin their nightly sojourns. Suddenly the owl cocked its head, puffed out its chest feathers, and launched itself noiselessly from its roost. It dropped feet first toward the ground far below, talons extended, eyes burning into the small brown shape, crouching beside a rotted piece of wood. Life had returned to normal for the small glen harbouring the Baldwin Mine.